So, July 1st, 1862. Humid air clung to the wooden walls of the Capitol as tired lawmakers argued over maps that stretched the length of the table, maps that treated the wide heart of the continent as empty space to be carved, sold, and crossed by steel. Outside Washington City, the country bled. Union dead lay under rough soil in Tennessee and Virginia, and families in Ohio, Iowa, and Kansas counted names that would never step back through the doorway. Yet inside the halls of Congress, men spoke of a line that would not stop for campaigns or casualty lists, a road of iron and telegraph wire that would run from the Missouri River to the Pacific, tying the states that stayed loyal to the Union and anchoring far western territories tighter to the federal government. On that day, the Pacific Railroad Act became law with Abraham Lincoln's signature. It granted immense strips of what legislators called public land to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, checkerboard bands stretching on each side of a future track. For the men drafting the law, those sections existed as neat squares on survey plats. On the ground, they cut directly across the hunting territories, winter camps, and travel routes of dozens of native nations. Words written in ink in Washington ignored older words already spoken and recorded in Indian country. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 had laid out a different map over the same grasslands and river valleys. That agreement made between U.S. commissioners and leaders from Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, and others recognized broad regions where each nation would live and hunt, and promised that those lands would be protected from encroaching non-native settlement. In exchange, the United States secured safe passage for emigrant roads like the Oregon Trail and pledged yearly goods. The treaty had barely survived a decade before pressure from miners, settlers, and new routes pushed new councils and new papers. Now the Railroad Act pressed a harder edge. Instead of wagon ruts and stage stations, it would bring a continuous corridor of graded earth, bridges, depots, section houses, sidings, and telegraph poles. The law assured companies that troops and federal authority would back their work crews and protect their improvements, no matter which treaty map their stakes pierced. In far lodges on the Platte, Republican, and Smoky Hill rivers, news of such plans did not arrive as clean diagrams. It came through interpreters at agency councils, through white traders repeating talk from St. Louis, and through mixed-blood freighters who had stepped inside eastern cities. There were descriptions of a fire wagon that did not need horses, a machine that pulled many cars at once and moved faster than a galloping pony. Some elders had already seen short lines along the Missouri or heard the shriek of locomotives near river towns, but the idea of iron stretching without break from one side of the continent to the other sounded like an exaggeration. In a Cheyenne camp near the South Platte, men joked that white planners believed they could tame blizzards and high winds with paper. They spoke about the Platte in spring when the river spread wide and shallow, turning banks to sticky mud that swallowed wagon wheels. They remembered sudden hailstorms that battered pony herds and flattened tents. To warriors who had ridden for days without seeing a single permanent building, the thought of a fragile iron road surviving buffalo herds, prairie fires, floods, and raids sounded bold and foolish at the same time. Lakota headmen along the Missouri weighed more than weather. They carried fresh memories of soldiers who had promised protection of village lands and then guarded surveyors instead. In councils held near Fort Randall and Fort Pierre, some speakers brushed aside the railroad talk as another distant idea that might never leave the mouths of agents. Others warned that nothing good came from lines drawn on American maps. They pointed to how quickly timber had vanished near river posts, cut and hauled away to supply steamboats and garrison buildings. If a path of iron came, it would only speed the rate at which game, grass, and wood disappeared. Along the overland trails, mixed traffic already cut through the plains. Ox teams dragged freight for merchants in Denver and Salt Lake City. Mormon wagon trains rolled toward the Great Basin. Stage lines hustled mail coaches over rough stations between the Missouri and the mountains. These roads had brought new trade goods to many native communities, including guns, ammunition, metal tools, and cloth. But they also had brought epidemic diseases, alcohol, and more permanent cabins along river bottoms. The Iron Road promised something sharper than a trail, an edge that would never close in winter and never fully rest at night. A few tribal leaders tried to read future consequences in the way white officials talked about the project. When Indian agents described the railroad to reservation councils, they spoke as if it were inevitable. They did not ask permission. They referred to the line as progress, as the future, as a gift that would bring markets and manufactured goods and quicker access to eastern cities. They said it would make it easier to bring annuity supplies. They avoided mention of the land grants that would move millions of acres into company hands and open more acreage to farming settlers once the tracks advanced. To the lawmakers in Washington, the people who lived along the proposed route appeared mainly as obstacles to be managed. Debate on the floor touched briefly on Indian difficulties and hostile tribes, but spoke more in terms of how many regiments might be needed to escort survey parties. Reports from military posts evaluated valleys by how easily a railroad grade could be cut through them, not by which bands had wintered there for generations. Where officers mentioned native communities, they often framed them as potential laborers or as threats to construction, not as owners of the soil. In villages along the Kansas and Nebraska frontier, the first survey teams began to move even before every detail of the law was settled. Railroad men with chains, transits, and notebooks rode ahead of graders, followed by heavy wagons hauling tools, rails, spikes, and food. They marked potential crossings over the Platte, and Republican drove stakes into ridge lines and penciled elevations and distances. Most camps sat under the protection of small military detachments. For Cheyenne and Lakota scouts watching from distant rises, these parties looked like any other group of road builders at first, another temporary stain on the grass that would fade once a route moved elsewhere. What changed was the steady, confident way the railroad parties advanced. Stage lines shifted when war parties struck a station. Traders moved posts when hunting grounds grew thin. These new columns did not bend to that pattern. When a survey party lost stock to theft or saw riders shadowing its route, it called for more soldiers and pushed on. Telegraphs back to Omaha or St. Joseph carried blunt messages about depredations and requests for reinforcement. From those offices, company officials pressed federal departments to respond quickly, reminding them that Congress had tied the undertaking directly to the Union war effort. The scale of the planned construction also set it apart. Each mile of track would demand ties cut from river groves and mountain slopes. Culverts dug and filled with stone, embankments raised across draws, and bridges thrown over streams and gorges. That meant thousands of laborers, camps every few miles, wagon trains of supplies, and more posts to guard the work. To native families who had watched the way even one trading fort could empty nearby groves and game in a few seasons, the thought of an endless chain of such consumption running from east to west sounded like a promise of famine. Early that summer, as Lincoln studied the bill, the northern plains still held enormous buffalo herds. Cheyenne and Lakota hunters rode out from encampments along the Republican and Little Blue, following dark, moving lines of animals that stretched for many miles. Children played among teepees set near water, and smoke from cooking fires mingled with the smell of hides being tanned. Women gathered chokecherries and wild turnips, watching the trail for signs of traders or soldiers. Life was not untouched by white expansion, but there remained room to move camps when pressure grew too strong in one place. In military and business circles, that same open space invited plans. Army officers and corporate promoters pointed to the buffalo herds and sparse settlement as proof that the land waited to be used more efficiently. They argued that a rail line would bring farmers who would turn grass into fields and fill empty stretches with towns, schools, and churches. They spoke as if native nations were temporary occupants contained within a few village clearings. They counted on federal treaties, annuities, and if needed, forced to move those communities aside. Not all native hearers dismissed the danger. Some leaders remembered how quickly the old fur trade era had shifted once steamboats began traveling the upper Missouri. Trips that had once taken weeks by keelboat now took days. Posts like Fort Union and Fort Pierre had grown almost overnight, attracting more non-native people and reshaping trade. Among Lakota and Cheyenne councils, a few men likened the railroad talk to that earlier change in river travel, not with poetic comparison, but with hard recollection of how small mechanical advantages had given traders tighter control over prices and timing. Still, the physical image of an unbroken iron path across plains, mountains, and deserts seemed to invite doubt. Hunters knew how deep snow carved drifts against coulees, how spring melt chewed away at riverbanks, how prairie fires raced ahead of wind, and how often the sky threw down lightning and hail without warning. The idea that white men could lay a fragile line through all of that and keep it clear year after year caused some in those councils to smile and shake their heads. The laughter carried no joy. It carried disbelief that people who already struggled to keep wagon trains alive through winter could imagine such a feat. In agency buildings on the Missouri and in frontier towns like Omaha and St. Joseph, a different tone dominated. Railroad agents spread pamphlets promising faster mail, cheaper freight, and new markets for Midwestern crops. Newspapers celebrated the act as a sign that the Union would endure long enough to finish such a grand project. Columns praised the president for looking beyond the current war to the long-term knitting together of regions. Little space in those printed lines described the native people whose lands would be crossed. When they did appear, they were described as wards to be civilized or foes to be subdued. The Pacific Railroad Act set milepost incentives that turned every length of track into money. For each section completed, companies would receive bonds and title to alternate land sections along the route. Executives read those clauses as encouragement to build as quickly as possible. For native communities, the same clauses meant that future decisions about grass, water, and timber would be made by distant boards of directors that had no stake in the survival of buffalo herds or the distribution of winter fuel along river bottoms. By nightfall on that 1st of July, the ink had dried on the parchment in Washington, and clerks had folded and filed copies. Lincoln and members of Congress turned back to reports from the front lines in the East. They spoke into the evening about generals, supply shortages, and politics inside border states. No drums marked what had just happened for the Lakota along the Missouri or for Cheyenne camps on the Platte. Fires burned in those camps as they always had, with children chasing each other around the ring of teepees and elders talking under the stars. Yet a line now existed where before there had been none, not on the ground, but in law. That line promised that the federal government would pour money, labor, and arms into a single corridor that cut straight through Indian country. Paper maps on Capitol desks now carried more weight than treaty belts held up in council lodges. In the years ahead, surveyors, graders, and armed escorts would follow those drawn routes west, turning ink strokes into embankments and steel. On the plains, the sound of wind through grass still muted every trace of that distant signing. But the decision taken in Washington had already begun to split the West in two. The Platte Valley lay wide and pale under the summer sun of 1865 when the first organized Union Pacific Survey columns pushed west from Omaha in earnest. Floodwaters had pulled back, leaving long bars of damp sand, braided channels, and muddy side sloughs. Cottonwood groves clung to the bends, their leaves rattling above camps of Oto, Omaha, and Pawnee families who had already felt decades of pressure from white towns edging up the Missouri. Beyond those tree islands, the grassland ran out toward a low, far line of bluffs where Cheyenne and Lakota scouts watched through dust-hazed air. At the head of the engineering parties rode men with transit instruments, chains, notebooks, and field glasses. Behind them came wagons loaded with food, tents, and tools, then rough crews carrying shovels and picks. They were Union Army veterans, Irish immigrants fresh off East Coast docks, freedmen looking for paid work, and laborers recruited in river cities with promises of steady wages. Most had never spent a night on the open plains before this job. They stepped into a landscape that did not care about their plans, but the company orders in their pockets told them to treat that land as an obstacle course to be measured and reduced. Each day began with the same routine. Before light spread fully over the river, cooks ladled coffee and boiled meat into tin plates. Teamsters checked harness, tightened chains, and coaxed stiff mules to the wagons. The chief engineer selected a line on his map that followed the Platte's general curve while avoiding marshes, steep ravines, and soft ground. Chainmen trudged ahead, stretching metal links between stakes, calling distances and noting each small rise. Flagmen set sighting points on the next ridge. Behind them, graders started to dig and fill, cutting shallow benches into the prairie to make a level bed for future ties. To Cheyenne and Lakota observers, the first weeks of work looked like any other temporary intrusion. There had been earlier survey parties that had passed and vanished. There had been freighting outfits that camped in one spot until grass thinned and then moved. From distant vantage points on the bluffs, riders counted wagons, noted the locations of temporary corrals, and watched how many soldiers guarded each camp. At night, they studied the way campfires clustered and how sentries walked. Reports carried back to larger encampments said that these workers cut more earth than others had. But at first, it still seemed that once the job ended, they would leave behind only scars that grass could reclaim. As the season advanced, the pattern changed. Instead of moving on and allowing a section of ground to rest, the railroad crews left behind a bare strip of graded earth that did not heal. They cut drainage ditches on either side, leaving piled banks that shaped water flow away from the future ties. At stream crossings, they dug out bottoms and started piling timber for trestles. Telegraph. Builders followed, setting poles and stringing wire that linked scattered work camps back to Omaha. Messages that had once taken days by courier between posts now traveled in a few heartbeats. Men who had never seen the plains before sat in tent offices and tapped coded signals that ordered more supplies, more workers, and when trouble appeared, more soldiers. Game in the valley noticed the disturbance quickly. Buffalo shied away from the noise, smoke, and constant movement near the grading line. Smaller herds shifted north and south to quieter ground, pulling predators and hunters with them. Antelope avoided fresh embankments and the sharp smell of cut earth. Geese and ducks, which had once settled freely in backwaters and oxbow ponds, started to lift away when blasting powder cracked and when saws chewed timber for bridges. For native families whose camps depended on meat from that river corridor, these changes meant longer rides to find animals and more time away from villages that still needed wood and water hauled each day. Cheyenne war societies sent young men closer to look. They slipped near camps after dark, feeling for the packed soil of the grade and learning how deep it ran. They counted the ties stacked along certain sections, noting how quickly piles grew. They watched the way guards rotated around picket lines and how tightly soldiers clung to their rifles even when walking between tents. Rumors had described a coming fire beast with wheels. What they saw this first year was only the preparation for its path, but the scale of that preparation carried its own meaning. Lines of chopped timber, mounds of gravel, and ordered rows of stakes said that the builders did not intend to abandon this cut ground. The Pawnee, who had long fought the Cheyenne and Lakota along this same river, took a different place in the new pattern. When officers in Omaha raised companies of Pawnee scouts under white command, those men brought their deep knowledge of local terrain to the railroad interest. They guided patrols along ridges and across fords, pointed out likely ambush spots, and tracked small parties that approached work camps. For the Pawnee leaders who accepted this alliance, the arrangement promised firearms, pay, and federal backing against enemies who had burned their villages and killed their people for generations. For Cheyenne and Lakota camps that saw Pawnee men riding with uniformed officers near the grade, it signaled that the new road arrived with old rivalries added to its guard. Work on the grade did not pause for every warning sign. In autumn of 1865, when word came that a mixed Cheyenne and Lakota force had struck a small troop column some distance from the line, the response from railroad headquarters was not to slow construction but to ask for more protection. Officers requested additional infantry from nearby posts, and new patrol schedules pushed outward from the camps. Engineers shifted a few survey lines around places that scouts reported as dangerous, but they did not alter the general plan. The priority remained steady progress along the Platte, mile by mile. The cold season revealed another side of the valley. Snow swept across the open ground, piling where wind broke against the bluffs and riverbank trees. Work gangs struggled to keep the grade clear. Frozen soil resisted picks. Hands cracked inside gloves. Food cooled on plates before men could finish a serving. Some days, when the temperature dropped too low, foremen had to call a halt and order crews back into tents or roughly built shanties to prevent frostbite. Illness moved quickly through crowded quarters, and grave mounds for dead laborers rose near the camps. Reports back to Omaha listed cause of death in brief terms like exposure, pneumonia, or accident. Those names on paper did not include mention of family names or home villages. In native encampments farther from the valley floor, the same winter brought difficult hunts. Buffalo had drifted more frequently onto upland ranges away from the constant disturbance near the works. Snow crusted over grass and forced herds to paw through ice to reach feed. Hunters followed, their ponies' legs churning through drifts. Journeys grew longer, and the route back to winter camps grew more dangerous each time storms swept in. Women in lodges spoke about missing men and sons who had not yet returned from chasing scattered herds. When talk turned to the grade along the Platte, some argued that the white disturbance had driven animals away, while others pointed to weather cycles and old stories of lean seasons. Both factors cut into food stores that year. In early spring, as ice broke and the Platte swelled again, the first locomotives rolled cautiously onto finished sections of track east of the main work front. Cheyenne and Lakota watchers finally saw the machine that had been described at distant councils. It carried a boiler that vented steam in sharp bursts, wheels that gripped the rails, and a headlamp that glared ahead, even in bright day. Smoke trailed behind and cinders fell along the right-of-way. When the engineer blew the whistle, the sound cut across the valley in a long, piercing blast that did not resemble any animal cry. Horses startled. Some broke away from picket posts. Children in nearby native camps covered their ears or stared toward the noise, trying to match stories to the heavy iron shape that now slid past cottonwoods. The train that first season did not yet stretch to the horizon. It carried only a few cars loaded with supplies for camps farther west. But even that short line represented a new fact. Where wagons had once crept along rough tracks at the mercy of mud and grades, this engine crossed over culverts and small bridges with a steady pace that barely changed with terrain. The grade beneath it did not twist to follow every dry rise. It cut across contours, built up where the ground dropped, and sliced into higher spots. For every mile it cleared, the distance between eastern warehouses and the front shrank. Railroad supervisors measured success with numbers and schedules. They counted how many miles of track reached beyond last season's endpoint, how many locomotives moved along the new section, and how fast rail ties and spikes arrived by steamboat to Omaha. They calculated the cost of guard detachments and the value of land tracts granted by the government for each section completed. Delays from storms or small raids appeared in their ledgers as obstacles to be absorbed or offset. They rarely wrote about the effect of their road on the people who had lived along the Platte long before any survey stake went into the soil. On the ground, the impact showed up in more immediate ways. Grass near the graded strip shortened steadily under the hooves of company stock and army horses. Woodlots that had once served as shared fuel sources vanished into bridge timbers and cord piles for locomotive boilers. Small creeks that once spread quietly into marshy flats now flowed through culverts shaped by hand and shovel, pulling water away from low spots where wild plants had grown. For native women who gathered roots and berries along the valley, these changes forced longer walks and more frequent moves of camp to reach usable ground. Tensions sharpened when railroad butchers began killing buffalo in large numbers to feed work crews. Bison carcasses lay in clusters near the line, stripped for meat and some hides with bones left to whiten. Cheyenne hunters who came upon such sights did not see careful use of an animal that carried deep meaning in their lives. They saw waste in piles of ribs and skulls left behind. War councils convened where older men reviewed past encounters with traders and soldiers and weighed new responses. Talk moved from watching and occasional theft of stock toward more direct action against the line. Soldiers assigned to protect the works understood that change as well. Patrols riding out from blockhouses and fortified camps met more frequent signs of hostile presence. Fresh pony tracks cut back and forth across the river. Telegraph wires were found sagging or cut with pieces removed entirely. Isolated hay-cutting parties reported being shadowed at a distance by mounted warriors. Commanders at small posts worried that a single misstep could leave a grading camp exposed. They sent requests for heavier weapons and more ammunition, arguing that the road's advance made their outpost vital to national interest. In mixed settler and railroad towns that sprang up near the line, the atmosphere felt different from the quiet Nebraska River communities that had existed only a few years earlier. Temporary tent quarters and hastily built gambling halls swarmed with construction workers on paydays. Whiskey ran in back rooms and around fire pits. Arguments fueled by liquor erupted into fights that left men bleeding in alleys. Women who followed the camps to earn money however they could worked in rough conditions and faced the constant threat of physical harm. Disease spread in crowded quarters. Sheriff offices, where they existed at all, struggled to impose order. Native visitors who entered these edge settlements saw no sign that the railroad effort would slow. Rails stacked along sidings, piles of spikes and fish plates, and rows of new ties gave a visual measure of what still remained to be laid. Locomotives under repair steamed and hissed at side tracks, ready to return to duty. Surveyors pored over notebooks and corrected line sketches by lamplight. Letters carried east on trains brought more investors and managers. The whole enterprise ran on a scale that set it apart from earlier frontier posts, and even those just passing through could sense that. By late 1866, the graded roadbed had reached well into central Nebraska, where the line cut through former camping spots alongside channels of the Platte. Families shifted main lodges to higher terraces or moved entirely to tributary valleys for a time. Hunters still crossed the grade on their way to follow herds, but each crossing carried more risk as traffic on the rails grew. Children in some camps spoke casually of the iron machine, pointing out distant smoke as another part of the world they were growing up in, not as an abstraction described in council. For elders who remembered days before any white post on the Platte, that change in tone cut deeply, because it meant that what had once seemed impossible had already sunk into ordinary life. The first phase of the railroad's physical approach along the Platte ended not with a single battle or agreement, but with the simple fact that graded earth and steel now marked hundreds of miles where there had once been only trails and seasonal camp circles. The planners in eastern cities measured the accomplishment in miles and costs met. The officers guarding the line measured it in patrol reports and casualty lists. Cheyenne, Lakota, Arapaho, and Pawnee communities measured it in the shifting routes of herds, the thinning of nearby resources, and the increased presence of armed strangers near their lodges. No formal notice announced that the valley's role had changed. But by the close of that second construction season, the Platte was no longer only a river road used by native and trader alike. It had become the main corridor of an advancing industrial order that would not willingly yield the ground it had claimed. The sun dropped behind the low Nebraska hills on the evening of August 6, 1867, when a Cheyenne war party settled into the folds of ground near the Union Pacific line west of Plum Creek Station. Heat still hung over the cut banks and dry channels, but shadow already filled the shallow ravines where the riders led their ponies off the open rises and out of sight of the track. Porcupine, a young northern Cheyenne warrior who had tasted war in Kansas that spring, studied the rails from a distance. He had come north after General Hancock's soldiers burned abandoned Cheyenne and Lakota lodges at Pawnee Fork, and after Custer's 7th Cavalry chased scattered bands across the Smoky Hill country. On that march, he had learned how quickly bluecoat columns could appear and how often white commanders ignored promises made in council lodges. Now he stood with a different band, led by men such as Turkey Leg and Spotted Wolf, watching a new kind of road cut across ground his people used for travel and hunting. The Union Pacific track here ran slightly above the surrounding prairie, carried over shallow washes by rough timber culverts and supported by embankments of packed fill. Telegraph poles paced the rails, their crossbars holding glass insulators that caught the last light. Farther east, the small cluster of buildings at Plum Creek Station hugged the line, a platform, section house, and few other structures meant to serve trains that now brought freight and passengers through in steady rhythm. The presence of that station and the constant noise of iron wheels had already altered the quiet of the valley. Porcupine and his companion Red Wolf lay in the grass and watched a freight train pass in the dimming light, its engine pushing a string of boxcars and flat cars. Smoke trailed low across the ground. The locomotive's headlamp glared weakly in the dusk. Men on the locomotive and in the cars looked outward only briefly. They had passed this stretch many times and trusted that section hands and patrols would keep it clear. When the last car rolled by and the sound faded, Porcupine turned to the others and spoke quietly about a different way to strike than the usual rush on a wood-cutting party or track gang. Most Cheyenne fighters understood how to hit moving freight wagons, how to drive off stock, how to burn haystacks, and how to ambush small patrols. This iron road presented a problem. The engine moved too fast for a direct rush from the side. Bullets bounced off heavy metal in most places. Even if riders killed a few trainmen with rifle fire, the train itself usually escaped along the rails. Porcupine had watched the way cars jolted on uneven track and had noticed how track workers spent long hours tamping gravel and adjusting rails. He reasoned that if the rails themselves were changed, the iron horse could be knocked from its path. The idea carried risk and uncertainty. No one in the party had tried to stop a locomotive before. There were no stories from elders describing such an attack, because the railroad itself was new on the plains. Some warriors laughed when he described the plan, saying the machine would crush any obstacle. Others listened harder when he spoke of the narrow wheels and of the way rails guided every movement. The war leaders finally agreed to let him and Red Wolf move close and see what might be done at a spot where the track crossed a small dry gully west of the station. As darkness deepened, Porcupine and Red Wolf crawled toward the line, leaving their ponies hidden behind a low rise. The ballast under the rails felt sharp under their hands. They had brought with them a heavy wooden tie taken from a nearby stack, along with rawhide thongs and some wire cut from an outlying telegraph pole. Working fast, they dragged the tie up to the rails and set it across the track, lashing it in place. To anyone glancing quickly along the line from a distance, the rails still appeared straight. Only up close did the obstruction show. They lit a signal fire a short distance away in the open, knowing that section hands would likely investigate when the telegraph line failed. The plan hinged on drawing out a small party first. Within a short time, the wires went quiet, and at Plum Creek, the absence of clicks on the telegraph set caused concern. 2 railroad men, Pat Handerhan and William Thompson, were ordered out on a handcar to check the line, carrying lanterns and their tools. They pumped the small car along the rails into the darkness, the squeak of the mechanism carrying faintly on the night air. Porcupine and Red Wolf waited near the obstruction, rifles ready. They heard the low grind of the handcar before they saw its light. When the lantern glow appeared, bouncing with the motion of the car, they tensed. The handcar hit the tie with a harsh scrape. Wood and iron clashed, and the car jumped from the rails, throwing both men off. Handerhan and Thompson scrambled, stunned, trying to understand what had happened. Shots cracked in the dark. Handerhan fell. Thompson took a bullet and hit the ground, badly wounded. The Cheyenne rushed forward, certain that both were dead or dying. In the harsh work light from one of the dropped lanterns, the warriors pulled at Thompson, stripped his scalp, and left him. He lay still, fighting the urge to move or cry out, even as blood ran down his head and face. Porcupine and Red Wolf rifled through the tools and supplies on the handcar and found 2 Spencer repeating carbines. The weapons opened at the breech, a motion unfamiliar to men trained only on muzzle-loading guns. When the rifles swung on their hinge, the Cheyenne thought they were broken and cast them aside. Thompson, somehow still conscious, waited until the raiders moved away and then dragged himself from the scene. Half blind from blood, dizzy, and in intense pain, he crawled toward the station, clutching his own scalp in one hand. Every movement risked reopening. The wound? Behind him, the Cheyenne regrouped, now confident that the railroad workers in this section were shaken and that the line lay vulnerable for a larger strike. Encouraged by the success against the handcar, Porcupine spoke of going further. It was not enough to frighten a few trackmen. To send a strong message, the warriors needed to hit a full train. The chosen spot lay near a shallow ravine where the line crossed on modest fill. There, a derailment would cause the most damage. Under cover of night, the band moved in with tools taken from earlier raids and with their own strength. They loosened spikes with track wrenches and with improvised levers. Rails came free from the ties, heavy but movable when several men lifted together. The Cheyenne bent the iron aside and shifted it away from the path an oncoming engine would expect. Ties went up on edge to form a more substantial barricade. In the darkness, the work went on by feel as much as sight, with whispered instruction and the occasional grunt of effort. By the time they finished, the rails no longer formed a smooth line. They became a trap. In the distance, the faint rhythm of an approaching train began to pulse through the rails. The firebox glow on the locomotive's front cast a red hint on the track ahead. Some of the Cheyenne mounted up and positioned themselves alongside the line, intending to harry the engine and distract the crew. As the locomotive drew near, they fired and yelled, riding close enough that sparks from the smokestack flew past them. One rider threw a lariat at the engine in a futile attempt to snag it. Inside the cab, Engineer Brooks Bauer heard gunfire and saw riders and muzzle flashes. He pushed the throttle forward, trying to outrun the danger along the line. The freight behind him banged and swayed as the cars responded. Fireman George Hendershot worked the shovel, feeding the hungry firebox with coal to keep steam up. Neither man knew that the track ahead had been shifted from its proper course. They had been trained to worry about raiders on the hills, not missing spikes beneath their wheels. The locomotive hit the damaged section at full speed. Metal screamed as flanges lost purchase. The engine left the rails, plunging forward into the small ravine. Bauer was thrown through the cab window, his body smashed against wreckage and ground. Hendershot, standing near the open firebox door with a shovel in hand, was hurled into the flames as iron and wood collapsed. Boxcars piled into the gap behind them, one after another, breaking apart, spilling cargo and crushing their own timbers. The noise rolled across the prairie, a long, crashing series of impacts followed by the roar of escaping steam and the crackle of fire. Warriors on horseback scattered briefly to avoid flying debris, then closed in as the movement of the train stopped. Some survivors among the train crew crawled from shattered cars and stumbled toward the rear, where a second train had halted, farther back on the line. Those who could move ran towards safety, leaving behind both dead and gravely injured men. The Cheyenne moved through the wreck with quick, practiced efficiency. They shot at any railroad employee who still posed a threat, then turned to the cargo. Crates split open under axes and rifle butts, spilling manufactured goods that had been bound for distant markets. Cloth bolts in bright colors, tools, food, and small hardware poured out onto the ground. Women in the village would use what could be carried. Warriors tied lengths of calico to their ponies' tails, letting the cloth stream out behind as moving flags. Several cars caught fire, either from spilled lanterns or from contact with the locomotive's shattered boiler and firebox. Flames climbed up wooden sides, lighting the area with harsh, jumping orange light. The smell of burned wood mixed with the sharp odor of spilled oil and scorched metal. Bodies near the engine lay twisted under fragments of iron and splintered boards. There was no tidy battlefield line here, only the sudden, chaotic aftermath of a machine ripped from its fixed course. Back at Plum Creek Station, the second train's crew had backed away to gather the residents and retreat to Elm Creek, understanding that staying near the wreck invited further attack. Telegraph silence and the distant glow of fire told them that the line had suffered a serious blow. In the hours that followed, messengers raced along the track toward military posts, carrying word that a train had been wrecked and that Cheyenne fighters were in the area in force. The next day, soldiers and reinforced track crews reached the site. They found burned cars, scattered goods, bent rails, and the bodies of Bauer and Hendershot, along with others killed in the action. Tools lay where they had fallen during the night's work. Hoofprints marked the approaches and withdrawals of the war party. The rail line that had seemed unshakable now showed plainly that it could be broken in a single night's concentrated effort. News of the derailment traveled quickly along the Union Pacific and into Eastern newspapers. Accounts emphasized the death of the engineer and fireman and the loss of cargo, painting the attack as evidence of savage resistance to progress. Railroad officials spoke of the need for stronger military protection, more blockhouses, and harsher measures against Cheyenne bands. Within Indian communities, the story spread as proof that the Iron Horse could be thrown down. For men like Porcupine, the memory of rails torn aside and a locomotive in a ravine became part of the growing list of responses to a road that cut steadily deeper into their country. The immediate result of the Plum Creek attack was not a halt to construction, but an increase in armed escort. Pawnee scouts under Frank North and additional regular troops patrolled more aggressively along vulnerable stretches. Blockhouses rose near key points. Section crews learned to watch the rails as well as the hills, and to inspect spikes and fish plates after any sign of nearby warriors. The Iron Road adapted, even as dissent and fear grew among its workers. For Cheyenne families moving through that region later that season, the derailed train site stood in memory more than invisible wreckage. Railroad crews cleared the line as quickly as possible, resetting rails, replacing ties, and removing ruined cars. Where there had been a hole in the right-of-way, workers filled it with new material and put trains back into motion. But the knowledge of what had happened at that gully did not disappear. It lived in stories told around evening fires, in railroad reports, and in the changing calculations of both sides. The Plum Creek derailment showed that Native fighters could strike at the railroad's core function, not just its scouts and work parties. It also provoked a tightening of the very system they opposed. Every new patrol, every additional blockhouse, and every reinforcement order sent along the wire reflected a government and a company that interpreted such attacks as further justification for stronger control over the plains. The wreck near Plum Creek became one sharp moment in a longer contest, a point where the Iron Horse bled and where the response deepened the divide between the advancing railroad order and the people who saw their land reduced to a corridor for steel. May 10, 1869 began with wind dragging dust across the high ground at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory. The air held the chill of lingering snow in distant mountains, but the sun threw sharp light on sagebrush, bare soil, and two approaching locomotives. From the east came Union Pacific number 119. From the west came Central Pacific's Jupiter. They moved slowly now, easing toward a short, unfinished gap in the rails where company men had arranged a show of union. Around the cleared space, several hundred people gathered. Railroad directors in dark suits and stiff hats stood near local dignitaries, army officers, and territorial officials. Near them waited telegraph operators who had strung wire directly to the site so the final blows of the ceremony could be relayed in real time to distant cities. Workers from both sides filled the edges, some still in rough clothes, faces lined from blasting rock or tamping ties. A small group of Chinese laborers from the Central Pacific stood to one side, far from the center where speeches would be made, their presence a reminder of years of hard labor that many in the official party preferred not to acknowledge publicly. The ground here did not belong to the men in tailored coats. It lay within country used by Shoshone, Paiute, and Goshute families who had seen survey parties, construction camps, and army escorts move through their water sources and hunting grounds in the years since work began. Some of those native families watched from greater distance that day, wary of the crowd and the soldiers on hand. To them, this meeting of engines was not an abstract symbol, but the visible joining of two invasive paths that would soon bring heavier traffic through their lands. Near midday, the lead men stepped forward. Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific stood with a polished hammer in hand. Beside him waited representatives of the Union Pacific. At their feet lay a laurel wood tie made special for the occasion, and a golden spike inscribed to mark the event, along with other ceremonial spikes of silver and gold sent by various territories and companies. The regular iron hardware used along the rest of the line had been set aside temporarily so the scene could carry more shine than the rough work that led to it. Speeches ran on, filled with praise for determination, national unity, and the supposed taming of a continent. Few words were spoken about the dead. There was no formal mention of Irish laborers killed in rock slides, Chinese men lost in explosions or buried by avalanches in the Sierra Nevada, or native people shot during clashes along the grade. The ceremony compressed years of risk and injury into polite phrases about enterprise and destiny. Telegraph operators waited for the only part many people outside the summit would note, the moment when a signal would confirm the last spike driven. At the agreed time, a telegraph operator touched a key that sent hats off across lines to waiting offices in San Francisco, Omaha, Chicago, and beyond. Stanford raised the ceremonial hammer. When he swung, he missed the spike and struck the tie instead, but the operator pressed his key anyway, sending the preset code that announced the completion. "Done" flashed along wires that followed the railroad right-of-way and connected to older lines back east. Church bells rang in some cities. Guns fired in salute in others. Newspapers had already set type for extra pages that would declare the continent linked by rail. After the formalities, the golden spike and laurel tie were removed for safekeeping. Ordinary iron spikes went into place, and a standard wooden tie took the weight of the rails. The locomotives Jupiter and number 119 moved up until their pilots nearly met. Crews and officials posed on cowcatchers, boilers, and tenders, while photographer Andrew Russell composed images on glass plates. Men from each company raised bottles, shook hands, and celebrated. In those photographs, the two engines faced each other over a gap now closed, and the scene looked like a final triumphant end to a contest. For the people whose lands the tracks crossed, the event signaled a beginning, not an end. Before this day, gaps between completed sections had slowed the movement of freight and passengers. Now a continuous route reached from Omaha through the Platte and Laramie Plains, across the high passes of Wyoming, over the Great Basin, through blasted tunnels on the Sierra Crest, and down to Sacramento and the Pacific Coast connections. At first, the line carried only a few scheduled through trains, but even those transformed distance. Travel that had once demanded months by ox team or by sea around South America could now be completed by rail in under 2 weeks, and in a few years in about 1 week. The first through passenger trains that followed the ceremony carried a mixed crowd. There were businessmen chasing opportunities in mining cities, land seekers with tickets to new settlements near sidings, soldiers reassigned to western posts, and adventurous travelers eager to claim that they had crossed the continent in comfort rather than in wagon boxes. Cars still jolted and shook as they crossed rough joints, and cinders blew in through open windows, burning clothes and skin. Coal smoke and the smell of hot metal filled the air, but even with those discomforts, the train offered a sense of power and speed that few had experienced. From the windows, passengers looked out over country that many still described as empty, even when camps or villages stood within sight of the right-of-way. On the Laramie Plains, they saw distant teepees near streams and columns of riders moving across open ground. In Utah Territory, they passed near settlements where Ute and Shoshone families camped close to springs. Some passengers raised rifles and shot casually at buffalo or antelope from moving cars, treating living animals as moving targets for idle amusement. Carcasses sometimes lay uncollected along the track, wasted meat left for scavengers. In native encampments, the sound of these early through trains cut across daily life. The whistle announced their approach long before they appeared. Hooves paused at that noise. Children and elders came out to watch the black shapes roll by. The speed impressed some, but the arrogance of riders firing at game or simply staring out at camp circles tightened anger. For those who had already seen survey parties and graders, the trains themselves represented the next stage of intrusion, bringing more people, more goods, and more soldiers into country that had once been shaped mainly by weather, animal movement, and seasonal migrations of tribes. The telegraph line that followed the tracks amplified the change. Military commanders used it to coordinate movements between distant posts. Messages about raids, peace offers, or troop shortages traveled in minutes instead of the days or weeks required by courier. When a clash occurred along the Platte or in Wyoming, news reached Washington and departmental headquarters quickly, and responses came just as fast. Orders to send reinforcements, to pursue a specific group, or to arrest individual leaders now rode back along the same rails that carried freight. At several points along the new route, small railroad service towns grew almost overnight. Places such as Cheyenne and Laramie in Wyoming Territory and Ogden in Utah Territory shifted from scattered clusters of tents and shacks into permanent settlements lined with depots, freight yards, warehouses, and rows of storefronts. These towns served as division points where locomotives were serviced and crews changed, but they also became centers for trade in hides, grain, timber, and livestock. For native bands that had once used nearby valleys for seasonal camps, the appearance of such towns meant crowded saloons, gambling halls, and brothels, followed by fenced lots, courts, and jails. Cheyenne and Arapaho families passing near these places sometimes traded for tools or cloth, but their encounters with residents often turned hostile. Local lawmen reflected the interests of merchants and railroad agents rather than the rights of native visitors. Complaints from settlers about stock missing or about riders near town edges led to calls for more Army support. Company officials argued that the railroad had to be protected for the sake of national commerce. That argument, repeated in telegrams and letters, gave military officers a convenient justification for expanding campaigns that aimed not only to secure the track, but also to confine entire tribes away from profitable corridors. In Utah and Nevada, Paiute and Goshute bands experienced the new line in a different terrain but under similar pressure. The rails crossed salt flats, dry valleys, and mountain foothills where springs and seeps marked critical water sources. Construction had already damaged some of these fragile places by diverting flow or contaminating them with waste from camps. Now trains stopped for water and fuel at sidings built directly over or beside key springs. Trackside tanks and coaling stations drew on local resources first, leaving native families to search farther for clean water and usable wood. Central Pacific managers had long dealt with conflict in these regions by calling for Army escorts and by pressing for treaties that would move native people away from the line. After the Golden Spike, their urgency increased. Every breakdown, raid, or sabotage attempt on this now continuous route threatened through traffic that investors regarded as vital for repaying bonds and land grants. Reports of even small thefts of stock or of rocks placed on rails traveled quickly to Western headquarters, and sometimes all the way to directors in California. From there, pressure returned toward local agents and officers to resolve Indian troubles permanently. The new overland route also changed the way prisoners and delegations moved, where earlier native leaders traveling to Washington or to departmental conferences had ridden in wagons or on riverboats for long stretches. Now they were often put aboard trains. Some went under guard, others as part of formal delegations that federal officials claimed would show them the size and strength of the nation. Men who had spent their lives riding across open plains now sat on narrow benches in crowded cars, watching familiar landmarks pass in compressed time. Forts that had once been distant several days' journey apart now flashed by in a matter of hours. For Apache, Navajo, and other southwestern peoples, that change would soon carry a harsher meaning, as rail became the most efficient way to transport prisoners to distant military posts and prisons. That pattern developed more fully in later years, but the outlines were clear as soon as the line proved its reliability. The same technology that made it easier to send delegations to negotiate also made it easier to break resistance by sending entire families far away from their homelands. Freight traffic expanded quickly after the connection. Carloads of manufactured goods rolled west, rails for branch lines, plows, and harvesters for new farms. Canned food, cloth, guns, and tools. In the other direction went ore from mines, hides from slaughtered buffalo, and grain from new fields. Every car had a direct link to land use along the route. More freight meant more warehouses, more sidings, and more local roads feeding into depots. Each of those features occupied space where native hunters had once ranged freely. On the Central Plains, the through line allowed buffalo hunters armed with large-caliber rifles to reach remote areas that had once been insulated by distance. With rail access, these men could ride to a railhead, move out onto the grasslands for a season, kill thousands of animals, and then haul hides back to the line for shipment east. The meat often rotted in place or was left to wolves. For native peoples whose economies and ceremonies centered on bison, the sudden acceleration of commercial hunting that followed the railroad connection amounted to a direct attack on their means of survival. The presence of a dependable rail route also changed military planning in Washington. Before 1869, large campaigns on the plains required long, vulnerable wagon trains to carry supplies from river posts or depots. Winter or bad weather could stall them for weeks. Now, heavy shipments of ammunition, rations, clothing, and building materials could travel quickly to railheads in Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, and Wyoming, then move by wagon into contested regions. Officers felt more confident ordering extended operations because they knew that the railroad could feed and equip their columns. That confidence translated into more aggressive campaigns against villages that refused to move to assigned reservations. There were isolated instances where the train brought short-term benefits to certain native individuals or small groups. Some men found paid work as scouts or guides for railroad survey parties extending branch lines. Others sold hay or wood to stations. A few women traded handmade goods to passengers. Those limited gains did not offset the broader loss of land, game, and freedom of movement. But they shaped how some communities tried to adapt. Negotiations with federal agents increasingly revolved around annuity goods and transportation arrangements along the rail routes, because so much of the commercial flow now followed that path. In urban newspapers, the connection across the continent was celebrated as proof that the interior of North America had been opened for development. Editorials described the end of isolation for California and other Western territories and promised that the line would carry new settlers into valleys still marked on maps as unsettled. Company advertising invited farmers from the Midwest and from Europe to come west along the Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines, offering discounted fares and sometimes land packages near the track. Those migrants often arrived with little understanding of existing native claims to the soil they were about to farm. Shoshone and Paiute families who tried to continue traditional seasonal rounds found more and more fences, irrigation ditches, and towns blocking old routes. Encounters that once occurred only occasionally at trading posts now became daily confrontations near water sources and crossings. The railroad itself stood as a physical barrier in some locations, with raised grades and deep ditches that cut across older footpaths and horse trails. People learned to gauge safe moments to cross, listening for whistles and feeling for vibration in the rails before stepping over. Children were warned to stay away from the trackside areas where loose couplings, shifting cars, and sudden movements could maim or kill. Promontory Summit itself did not become a large permanent town, but the symbolic weight of the ceremony held on its soil, pushed policy in multiple directions. Federal leaders pointed to the meeting of the rails as evidence that the United States could project its power and economy across the entire continent. They used that claim in diplomatic talks with European governments and in internal debates over how to administer Western territories. In those same debates, native nations appeared only as obstacles or as potential wards. There was little recognition that the land was already organized by treaties and traditions before surveyors marked it for track. In the months after the Golden Spike, the rhythm of the new overland road settled into place. Daily schedules posted in depots gave departure and arrival times at major points. Passengers began to trust that those times would be met with some regularity. Mail cars moved letters and newspapers that now carried both local gossip and reports from far cities with a speed that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Telegraph messages continued to handle urgent communication, but the trains gave weight to abstract words by moving troops and cargo in response. For native families living near the route, that consistency fostered a different feeling. The regular passage of trains day and night underscored how fully control of movement had shifted. Where once the pace of life had followed harvests, hunts, and the cycles of rivers, it now had to account for the relentless schedule of machines that did not respect seasons or ceremonies. People could see that the line brought wealth to railroad towns and to investors far away. They could also see that it gave the federal government and private companies a lasting grip on the central corridor of the West. By tying together earlier segments of track into one continuous artery, the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory did more than close a gap between Omaha and Sacramento. It created a dependable route that carried settlers, soldiers, hunters, and officials deep into lands that native nations had long managed on their own terms. From that day forward, every plan for the plains, the Great Basin, and the Mountain West would assume that the iron rails and the telegraph line beside them were permanent features. For the peoples whose homelands lay along the route, the new overland road marked a turning point after which their struggle to maintain space, animals, and authority became far more difficult. Because the line now allowed the rest of the country to reach into their world quickly and without pause. Dust rolled up from the Arkansas River Plain in early autumn of 1872, when the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe rails reached the low rise that became Dodge City. The river curved broad and shallow across the sandy bed, cottonwoods marking the bends near Fort Dodge a few miles to the east. Prairie stretched south into the Comanche and Kiowa hunting country, and north into open buffalo range. The new track ended in a raw cluster of shacks, tents, and hastily framed depots. Men stepped down from flat cars onto ground that only months earlier had been crossed mainly by army patrols and native hunting parties. The first trains that stopped there brought ties, rails for further extension, barrels of nails, sacks of flour, barrels of salt, kegs of gunpowder, and heavy crates of Sharps rifles. Merchants followed close behind. They nailed together false fronts for stores and saloons facing the track so that every arriving passenger saw their names first. A rough platform served as both freight dock and gathering spot. Cattle still grazed near the river, but talk around campfires in the new town focused more on buffalo hides than on steers. Men in worn coats studied the southern horizon and saw not only herds but currency. In 1872, the southern bison population still moved in huge bodies across the Texas Panhandle and western Indian Territory. Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho bands followed those animals with lodges, families, and long tradition. Hunting trips into that country involved careful planning, respect for grass and water, and use of nearly every part of each animal taken. Meat filled drying racks, hides became clothing and shelter, sinew turned into bowstrings, and ribs and other bones went into tools. The herds provided food, trade goods, and a central pillar of spiritual life. For railroad executives and hide buyers, the same animals represented a commodity that could be converted quickly into money in eastern tanneries. A railhead at Dodge City solved a problem that had limited earlier killing sprees farther north along the Kansas Pacific. Here the track sat closer to the heart of the southern range. Hunters could ride out in wagons pulled by oxen, kill thousands of animals in a season, and return with stacks of hides and later with bones to be loaded directly into freight cars. The cost of transporting heavy loads to market dropped sharply, which meant that even men with modest means could join the trade if they reached the town with enough capital for guns, ammunition, wagons, and crews. Within months of the first locomotive's arrival, Dodge City filled with hunters, skinners, freighters, gamblers, and women working in boarding houses and cribs. Tin signs for hide buyers appeared near the depot. Agents weighed and counted piles of hides, noting totals in ledgers. Flyers posted in saloons offered credit to men heading south for a season, with repayment expected in cured hides brought back before winter. The smell of fresh blood, tobacco, sweat, and cheap liquor clung to the narrow streets. Gunfire sounded at all hours as men tested rifles, settled arguments, or fired into the air out of drunken habit. A typical hide outfit left town with a wagon loaded high with flour, bacon, coffee, salt, lead, and powder. 2 or 3 hunters rode with heavy Sharps rifles that could drop a bison at long range. Skinners traveled with them, men whose hands bore deep calluses from pulling hides from carcasses. Teamsters managed the oxen and mules. They rolled south and southwest into the rolling plains, following reports from scouts and from other outfits about herd locations. Once they found a sizable group, they set up a base camp with tents and stacked supplies, then rode out at first light to begin killing. The method became routine. Hunters approached the edge of a herd from downwind, dismounted, and rested their rifles on cross sticks. They picked out led animals, aiming low to break shoulders or lungs. Each shot sent another bison staggering or collapsing. But as long as the wind carried the smell and sound away from the main body, the herd often milled in confusion instead of fleeing. Hunters reloaded quickly, working the heavy breech blocks by practiced habit. By the time the animals finally broke and ran, dozens or hundreds already lay on the ground. Skinners came in behind, knives ready. They slit down bellies, peeled hides back, and cut away thick sheets of skin and the layer of fat beneath. Meat often remained where it fell. Some outfits harvested tongues and a few choice cuts for food and for sale. But the main value lay in the hides. Carcasses began to rot under the sun, drawing wolves, coyotes, and flocks of scavenger birds. The air around a busy camp carried a constant stench of decay mixed with the sharp smell of curing hides treated with salt. Comanche and Kiowa parties watching from a distance saw a level of waste that stunned them. Earlier encounters with non-native hunters had involved smaller groups who still took time to use meat and to pack animals carefully. Now long lines of dead bison stretched across the prairie with only skins removed. Bones lay scattered after predators and scavengers had fed. From ridges or shallow draws, native observers counted the number of carcasses, measured how close they lay to trails, and noted the location of camps. Stories carried back to villages described scenes where, in a single day, more animals died than whole bands might take in a season under older practices. As word spread about the profits to be made, more outfits left Dodge City each year. Some men came from Missouri, Illinois, and further east. Others drifted up from Texas. Many had little attachment to the land they hunted over. They saw it mainly as a temporary workplace. Campfire talk in the hide camps focused on prices per hide, on credit terms with buyers in Dodge City, and on rumors of even larger herds beyond the next line of hills. When native riders appeared at a distance, the discussion turned to defense. Hunters leaned their rifles close at night and set extra watches. Tensions flared early in the slaughter. Comanche and Kiowa leaders confronted some outfits directly, demanding that they leave. In certain cases, hunters tried to buy time by trading a few goods or sharing some meat, but the pattern of killing did not change. The arrival of more Sharps rifles and a steady supply of ammunition from the railhead gave the outsiders confidence that they could hold off war parties long enough for army columns and agencies to tighten control. Letters and newspaper accounts from the time show that some hunters understood the broader goal too, expressing satisfaction that the destruction of the herds would force native bands to depend on government rations. Dodge City's streets reflected that mentality. As hides poured in, stacks rose along the trackside, layer on layer of stiff, dried skins. Railroad men built platforms to keep them off the ground, but as shipments grew, the piles spread outward. Flies swarmed over drying flesh that clung in places. Dogs fought over scraps along the edges. The odor spread through the town, mingling with smoke from locomotives and coal oil lamps. Freight trains pulled away with cars full of hides bound for eastern tanneries where they would become industrial belts and leather goods. Bone gathering followed as herds diminished. Once hunters had stripped an area of most bison, crews returned to gather skeletal remains. They loaded wagon beds with skulls, vertebrae, and leg bones gathered from fields that only a few years earlier had held moving herds. Those loads went to Dodge City as well, then east on trains to be processed into fertilizer and other products. The trade reduced what remained of the physical presence of the bison on the southern plains to another line in freight records. For Comanche and Kiowa villages along tributaries of the Red River and Canadian River, the impact on daily life was immediate. Winter stores shrank. Hunting trips required longer rides and brought back fewer animals. Hunger edged into camps, especially among children and elders. Leaders who had long resisted treaties that confined them to set areas now faced the hard fact that the animals that supported mobility and independence were vanishing. Even warriors accustomed to hardship could see that this change did not come from ordinary fluctuations in herd movement, but from a deliberate human campaign fueled by outside demand and sustained by the rail line at Dodge City. South of the Kansas line, tensions built toward open conflict. In the spring of 1874, a large coalition of Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors moved against a group of hide hunters camped near the old Adobe Walls trading post site in the Texas Panhandle. Those hunters had come from the railheads to the north, hauling heavy rifles and supplies obtained, partly on credit from Dodge City merchants. Their presence deep in key hunting territory and the sheer volume of animals they killed drew a response that went beyond earlier small raids. On a June morning, the warriors attacked, expecting to overrun the camp and drive the hunters out permanently. They rode in at speed, yelling, firing, and trying to close the distance before the men in the post could organize. The hunters, however, had long-range rifles and solid walls to use as cover. They fought from firing ports, using their weapons' reach to deadly effect. Several attackers fell before they could get close enough to set fires or break into buildings. After repeated charges met with heavy losses, the native force pulled back. News of the fight at Adobe Walls rolled back to Dodge City and then east by rail and telegraph. Reports described a dramatic stand by a handful of white hunters against a much larger native force. In many accounts, there was little attention to the reasons that had brought such a large group of Comanche and Kiowa warriors together in the first place. The context of bison destruction and the proximity to traditional hunting grounds often appeared only as brief background. What stood out in most white narratives was the image of hide men and traders defending themselves with powerful rifles, reinforcing the view that the hunters represented legitimate commerce and that native fighters posed a threat to order. Federal authorities used the attack as a justification for a broad campaign on the southern plains. The railheads at Dodge City and other Kansas towns became staging points for the Red River War. Supply trains loaded with rations, ammunition, and equipment rolled into the depots. From there, long wagon columns carried provisions south to military camps and forward bases. Officers such as Nelson Miles and Ranald Mackenzie relied on that steady flow to keep columns in the field for extended operations, pushing into canyons and across high plains where Comanche and Kiowa families had long moved with the seasons. Army scouts traced trails from abandoned villages where teepees had been cut and left behind in hasty moves. Camps found in sheltered draws contained drying racks knocked over, tools scattered, and in many cases piles of bison bones that spoke of earlier, more secure winters. Columns pressed hard through the summer and fall of 1874, demolishing horse herds, burning lodges, and capturing women and children. Captured groups went under guard to Fort Sill or other posts, then onto reservations. Men who had once ridden freely across the Buffalo Plains found themselves confined, dependent on issued flour and beef. Meanwhile, Dodge City continued to ship hides. Even as the southern herd thinned, hunters combed remaining pockets of animals, pushing farther into canyons, mesas, and broken country. What had begun as an apparently limitless resource shrank rapidly. By 1878, reports from the field and from Army officers began to describe southern bison as nearly gone. Hunters still scouted for stray groups and lone animals, but the days of massive commercial killing in that region had ended. The railhead that had fed off the herds turned more completely to cattle shipments and to serving as a supply center for a transformed plains economy. On reservations in Indian Territory, Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne leaders confronted the consequences. Their people now stood in line for ration issues, accepting sacks of flour, coffee, sugar, and occasional meat. Agency officials insisted that they learn farming on small plots around the agencies. Despite poor soil and the unsuitability of that lifestyle for many who had spent their lives tracking herds and managing large hunting territories. Speeches at councils emphasized that the buffalo were gone and that dependence on issued food was the new reality. Some leaders signed documents under extreme pressure, hoping to secure at least some guaranteed supplies, while others protested and found themselves sidelined or imprisoned. Stories about the slaughter traveled back into those communities in the voices of warriors and hunters who had watched it firsthand. Men described the sight of white hunters taking aim at cows heavy with calves, of calves left bawling beside dead mothers, of fields full of rotting carcasses. They recalled the noise of Sharps rifles firing again and again through a single day, and the endless work of skinners stripping hides from bodies that no one intended to eat. For younger listeners on the reservations, these accounts sounded less like recollections of ordinary hunts, and more like reports from a different world that had closed down before they reached adulthood. In Dodge City, few paused to consider that loss when counting profits. As bison vanished, cattle and sheep moved more heavily into the surrounding range, fenced pasture slowly replacing open travel corridors. The same rails that had carried hides now took herds of longhorns east from the cattle drives that ended in the town's stockyards. Violence shifted form but did not go away. Fights in saloons, shootings in alleys, and clashes between drovers and townsmen kept the reputation of Dodge City as a place of hard living. Even while the deeper transformation of the plains went unspoken in casual talk. The tracks that tied Dodge City to the eastern markets had turned the southern buffalo herds into freight. Without the railhead, individual hunters could still have taken animals, but the scale would have been limited by distance and transport costs. With it, every hide became part of a steady flow, counted, stacked, and moved out with mechanical regularity. The partnership between railroad, hide buyers, and hunters turned an animal that stood at the center of several native nations' livelihoods into a diminishing resource measured only in carloads. By the end of the 1870s, riders from Comanche and Kiowa settlements who ventured back toward former hunting grounds south of the Arkansas River found grass where herds once moved, scattered bones and draws, and an occasional lone animal that drew more sorrow than hope. Trains still came and went from Dodge City, their whistles and wheels marking time. For the native communities forced onto reservations, the sound represented not just a new mode of travel, but a reminder of the link between that town, its rails, and the deliberate destruction of the herds that had fed and anchored their world. By the early 1870s, survey stakes for the northern Pacific began to creep toward the upper Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. Pushed along by company officers in New York and Philadelphia, who stared at maps and saw a future line running from Lake Superior to the Pacific Northwest. On paper, their route cut across Dakota Territory and into the valleys of the Yellowstone and its tributaries. On the ground, that plan reached into the remaining strong hunting country of the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, and into lands the Crow still regarded as their own. The first serious reconnaissance parties moved out from Missouri River posts in 1871, traveling by steamboat and wagon. Engineers rode at the center, their boxes packed with transits, levels, and drawing tools. Infantry and cavalry companies marched alongside, rifles stacked in camp at night and loaded on the trail. Boat captains eased shallow draft steamers upstream, noses pushing against current while soldiers scanned bluffs and coulees for riders. Each stop brought out surveyors who climbed ridgelines, shot angles, and tried to imagine where future fills and trestles might sit. The Yellowstone Valley they entered carried a different character from the open central plains. Cottonwoods lined the river bends, their trunks scarred by past high water and by axes from visiting hunting parties. Steep cut banks dropped from the edges of benches down to gravel bars and side channels. Short grass covered upland flats broken by sage and scattered patches of brush. Game moved along this corridor in regular patterns. Elk came down to feed at dusk. Buffalo drank at sandbars and moved back to higher ground when the sun climbed. Crow camps, when set along the river, used its course as a spine for daily life. For years, the Lakota had pushed west and north into this region, challenging Crow control and fighting for access to the same herds and same sheltered winter spots. Victories in earlier decades had given Hunkpapa and Oglala hunting parties confidence that they could ride into the Yellowstone country as they pleased, so long as they remained ready to fight. Now news from the Missouri agencies spoke of a coming railroad from the north as well as of the completed line farther south. Men who had already watched the Union Pacific cut across their hunting grounds listened with anger when agents described another track plan through the Yellowstone Valley. Tatanka Iotake, known to soldiers and agents as Sitting Bull, heard those reports at Grand River and other camp councils. He had already refused to sign away rights to the Powder River country and had mocked earlier promises that agreed lines on treaty maps would protect Lakota land. When interpreters repeated talk about the Northern Pacific, he understood that this was not just another road for wagons. It was a plan to bring trains, stock, and towns into one of the last regions where his people could still hunt in strength without being ringed by forts and agency posts. His resolve to keep surveyors and track crews out hardened with each piece of news. In 1871, the combination of difficult terrain, cautious commanders, and uncertain supply lines kept the Northern Pacific reconnaissance from pushing too far beyond the Missouri posts. Surveyors got enough information to sketch possible routes, but they also brought back stories of riders watching from distant ridges and of fresh lodge poles near likely crossing points. Army officers understood that any serious attempt to plant stakes deep along the Yellowstone would draw the attention of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne bands who already knew the country well. They argued that a larger, well-supplied expedition would be needed if the line wanted more than tentative notes and rough sketches. Company directors agreed and pressed the War Department for protection. By 1873, a major Yellowstone survey expedition formed under Colonel David Stanley, with portions of the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer attached as escort. The column left Fort Rice in Dakota Territory in midsummer, wagons rattling out with boxes of survey gear, food, ammunition, and camp equipment. Cavalrymen rode in files, carbines slung, sabers left mostly in scabbards because experience on the plains had already taught that firearms mattered more than bright steel. Crow Scouts rode with the column, hired to guide and to identify signs of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne presence. For the Crow, working with the soldiers involved both opportunity and bitter calculation. They had long fought Lakota intrusions into the Yellowstone and Bighorn country, and had lost people and horses in those clashes. They saw the Yellowstone Valley as theirs by tradition and by older agreements with traders and the government. When Northern Pacific surveyors and Army officers offered pay and rations in return for guiding and scouting, many Crow leaders accepted, seeing a chance to weaken enemies who had taken over their hunting grounds. At the same time, they understood that the railroad would not stop at the edge of Crow land. But in that moment, the more immediate concern lay with the Lakota pressure. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne scouts watched the Stanley expedition from the moment it left the Missouri. Riders moved along distant ridge lines, counting wagons, noting the number of cavalry companies, and watching where the column camped each night. They reported to larger encampments along tributaries of the Yellowstone, where leaders met in councils lit by firelight. Men who had fought soldiers along the Bozeman Trail and in earlier campaigns spoke about how to deal with a moving force tied to survey stakes. They understood that killing a few engineers would not stop the line if the government remained determined, but they also knew that repeated attacks on small parties, stock herds, and isolated work groups could slow progress and send a message that the valley was not open ground. The expedition moved slowly along the Yellowstone, stopping often so surveyors could measure distances and angles. They looked for firm banks where a future track could sit without sliding, for places where the river did not cut too close to cliffs, and for approaches to likely bridge sites. They noted timber stands that might provide ties and trestle materials. Every time they spread out, they exposed small groups of men on foot or on horseback beyond the tight protection of the main camp. Lakota leaders watched for such opportunities and waited for moments when surprise could be used to full effect. One of the first sharp blows fell near a bend in the Yellowstone that later took the name Honsinger Bluff. In late summer, while the main column camped near the river, civilian veterinarian and contractor Dr. John Honsinger rode out with a small detail to graze and water horses away from the crowded camp and to look for better forage. With him went a teamster and a guide. They believed that Crow scouts and earlier patrols had cleared immediate threats. The day ran clear, the river moving in broad, steady flow against the far bank, grass short but usable near the water. As the party moved along a low flat near the river, Lakota warriors who had been watching the camp took their chance. They had studied the pattern of small groups riding out for wood, grass, or game, and knew that this routine lulled some soldiers into lowering their guard. A group of mounted fighters slipped between folds of ground, using brush and minor rises for cover until they were close enough. They then rushed in at speed, rifles firing and bows sending arrows. The small party from the column had little warning and almost no cover. Dr. Honsinger and his companions tried to reach thicker brush or to fall back toward the larger force, but the distance proved too great. Horses went down under fire. Men on foot made desperate stands with carbines and revolvers, but they were overwhelmed. By the time soldiers from the main camp recognized that shooting reflected more than routine target practice and sent help, the fight was over. Searchers later found the bodies of Honsinger, the teamster, and the guide stripped and mutilated in patterns that soldiers had seen in earlier conflicts. For the column, the site became a marker of how vulnerable even short trips away from camp could be. The bluff and its surrounding ground took the doctor's name in Army reports, a harsh reminder each time the expedition's path took it into view. Custer reacted by tightening control over foraging parties and by increasing the number of armed men sent even on simple errands. Officers lectured troops on keeping weapons loaded and on never moving alone beyond the immediate camp perimeter. Surveyors who had already walked many miles with chain and transit found their work slowed further as escorts had to be arranged for every movement beyond the main body. Time spent organizing protection ate into hours that company leaders had hoped to devote to precise measurements. Lakota councils along the Yellowstone River heard of the success with grim satisfaction. The death of Hansinger did not by itself throw back the expedition, but it proved that small detachments could be cut off and destroyed. It sent a warning that soldiers could not relax near the river, even for chores that usually felt safe. Stories of the ambush spread quickly between camps, carrying details of how the party had been watched, how the move toward forage had provided an opening, and how the attackers had closed that gap. Young men listened closely, eager to gain credit for similar strikes. Later that summer, another engagement unfolded near a broad bottomland that came to be known as Pease Bottom. There, the survey expedition and its escort halted near a suitable landing spot for steamboats that brought additional supplies up the river. The camp sprawled across a flat above the water with wagons in lines, picket ropes for horses, and tents set in rows for companies and survey teams. Custer's cavalry troopers drilled nearby when not on scout, riding out in formation and practicing deployments. Crow scouts moved through the surrounding country looking for signs of approaching Lakota and Northern Cheyenne fighters. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne leaders, including Sitting Bull and others who had risen through earlier campaigns, decided that a larger demonstration was needed. They gathered sizable forces along tributaries feeding into the Yellowstone, bringing together bands that had once hunted separately but now shared a common interest in keeping the Northern Pacific out. Warriors painted faces and bodies with designs tied to their individual war experiences, mounted their best horses, and moved through coulees and over ridgelines toward the soldier camp. They aimed to test the escort's strength and resolve and to show that even a large, well-armed force could be harassed in this river valley. On the morning of the fight, Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders appeared near the camp in scattered groups, probing its edges. Some fired from a distance, testing the soldiers' response. Custer and Stanley ordered companies into skirmish lines, men dismounting and spreading out with carbines ready. Artillery crews brought light pieces into position, their guns pointed toward likely approaches. Crow scouts took up positions beside the soldiers, eager to prove their value against longtime enemies. The air filled with dust as horses moved and the ground shook under hooves. The attack came in waves. Mounted warriors swept in close enough to fire, then wheeled away before sustained volleys could cut them down. They used the broken ground of the bottomland, riding into and out of swales and behind low rises to spoil soldiers' aim. Some tried to draw cavalry companies out from the protective line by feigned retreats, hoping to split smaller groups away where they could be surrounded. Custer, who had built his wartime reputation in a different kind of fighting, had to adapt to an opponent that refused to stand in one place. The fight at Pease Bottom lasted for hours, with bursts of intense shooting followed by periods where both sides shifted positions. Several soldiers fell, hit by bullets or arrows that found gaps in their hasty cover. Crow scouts also took casualties, a bitter price in a conflict they had entered in part to regain advantage over intruders on their homeland. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne fighters lost men as well, struck by disciplined volleys and by artillery shells when they came too close in groups. Bodies from both sides lay in the trampled grass, some close enough to the river that water lapped at their boots or leggings. As the day wore on, the expedition's fire discipline and its access to ammunition and artillery began to tell. The soldiers held their ground around the camp and kept Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders from breaking into the wagon park in force. Supply piles and survey equipment stayed under guard. By late afternoon, the attacking force pulled back to higher ground, firing occasional shots but no longer pressing close. From their ridges, they could see that they had inflicted pain yet had not scattered the escort. They had, however, made clear that any movement along the Yellowstone would come at a cost. Inside the camp, the mood after Pease Bottom mixed relief with anger. Troops counted their dead and wounded. Surgeons worked in crowded tents over men torn by rifle fire, arrowheads, and splinters. Surveyors walked among the lines, seeing with new clarity how much their safety depended on the soldiers' presence. Officers discussed whether continuing the expedition deeper into contested ground made sense, given the opposition they had just faced and the limited time remaining before weather would turn against them. Telegraph lines back to department headquarters carried reports that painted the fight as a hard-won defensive success, but also admitted that surveys had been slowed. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne camps held their own councils afterward. Warriors who had fought at Honsinger Bluff and Pease Bottom recounted their experiences, describing the way the soldiers had formed lines, the effect of artillery, and the number of animals and men hit on both sides. They took pride in having struck the survey escort twice in one season, and in having shown that the Yellowstone was not an easy corridor for the railroad. At the same time, they recognized that the column had not been destroyed. It still possessed more food, more ammunition, and the ability to call on reinforcements later if the company and the government decided that the line was important enough. By the end of that campaign season, the expedition withdrew eastward. Cold nights and frost on canvas signaled that autumn had arrived. Grass along the trail showed the wear of many hooves and wheels. The survey team carried back notebooks filled with measurements, rough maps of the Yellowstone's bends, and notes about timber and rock suitable for construction. They also carried casualty lists. Company officials far from the river would read those reports alongside cost estimates and investor demands and weigh when and how to return with more crews. On the Northern Pacific's planning tables, the result of the Yellowstone expeditions appeared as partial progress. They had gained knowledge of possible routes but had not driven stakes in a continuous line or begun grading. Conflict with Lakota and Northern Cheyenne forces had exposed how much resistance could be mounted when a railroad intruded into an intact hunting area that still supported many independent bands. For the moment, the company focused more heavily on finishing eastern sections of the line, leaving the Yellowstone Valley as an unresolved segment. For Lakota and Northern Cheyenne communities, those same years represented a brief period when organized resistance had checked one of the major new rail projects. Men who had fought in the valley could point to specific ground where survey parties had been turned back or delayed. They could name the places where soldiers had bled and where engineers had hesitated to set instruments on open rises. Around evening fires, laughter broke out when someone mocked newspaper drawings that showed a future steel path along the Yellowstone as if it already existed, even though those who knew the valley understood that no ties or rails lay there yet. Under that laughter, however, sat the knowledge that the government's reach had grown. Steamboats still moved on the Missouri and Lower Yellowstone, carrying supplies to posts that ringed Lakota country. Other railroad lines advanced along the Platte and into western Kansas, bringing more settlers, more hunters, and more troops. The Northern Pacific delays did not restore earlier balance. They only postponed the moment when steel and telegraph wire would approach from the north. Leaders like Sitting Bull and other headmen folded the lessons of Honsinger Bluff and Pease Bottom into their understanding of federal determination and into plans they would make when the next larger campaigns came. As winter closed in after the Yellowstone expeditions, snow covered the tracks of both soldiers and surveyors. Buffalo still moved through parts of the valley, though in smaller numbers than before. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne camps shifted to sheltered draws and timbered bottoms, tending fires, repairing gear, and telling stories of the season's fights. In that pause, the Yellowstone remained free of rails. The memory of hard blows struck along its banks, and of columns turned back before they could open a permanent corridor, gave some measure of satisfaction, even as the larger pattern of pressure around them continued to tighten from other directions. In the summer of 1874, Wagons rolled out of Fort Abraham Lincoln on the Missouri River carrying soldiers, civilian teamsters, scouts, and surveyors into the high ridges and forested draws of the Black Hills. At the head of the column rode Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and elements of the 7th Cavalry, followed by long strings of pack mules and freight wagons that had come up to the fort on Northern Pacific steamers and by rail from farther east. Crews at dockside had unloaded barrels of flour, crates of ammunition, picks, shovels, and measuring instruments. All of it moved to the frontier post in bulk because trains and boats could now funnel material into Dakota Territory on a scale that would have been impossible a decade earlier. The Black Hills rose dark against the sky as the expedition approached from the northeast. Pine and spruce trees covered slopes that broke sharply from the surrounding grassland. Clear creeks cut through narrow valleys, their banks lined with willow and birch. To Lakota people, these hills were not just another hunting ground. They carried deep religious meaning, held places of vision and story, and stood at the heart of lands recognized in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. That treaty had promised that no unauthorized white person would enter the Black Hills without Lakota consent. The column that entered in 1874 did not ask for that consent. It moved under orders from the Department of Dakota to inspect the region and to look for potential sites for posts and routes. Civilian prospectors attached to the expedition carried pans and picks. When soldiers made camp near French Creek, some men slipped away to wash gravel. They found flakes and small grains of gold in the stream beds. Word spread quickly inside the column. Officers noted the presence of gold in official reports. Newspapers back east soon carried stories of a discovery in the Black Hills that matched earlier tales from California and Colorado. Lakota camps along the Missouri and in the Powder River country heard those stories in translated form at councils. Headmen such as Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, and others who had traveled to conference tables knew how quickly rumors of gold drew miners and speculators. They had seen it happen along the Bozeman Trail and in Montana. They also understood that once gold seekers entered a region in numbers, the government often yielded to their demands rather than enforcing treaty boundaries. In lodge circles, men spoke plainly about the danger. Women worried aloud about what would happen if streams in the Black Hills filled with strangers, and if timber there fell to build their camps. Despite treaty language, miners began slipping into the hills in increasing numbers in 1874 and 1875. Some came up the Missouri to Bismarck and then by wagon and stage into the interior. Others traveled west by rail to Cheyenne or Sidney, Nebraska, riding the Union Pacific, and then took stage routes such as the Sidney-Deadwood and Cheyenne-Black Hills roads. Rail lines did not yet penetrate the Black Hills themselves, but they brought people, equipment, and food to the edge of Lakota territory, far faster than any overland trail alone. Stage outfits advertised regular service from the railheads to new camps like Custer and Deadwood, promising that passengers could reach the diggings after only a few days of hard travel from the end of the track. Every new wagon train running south from Bismarck or north from Cheyenne cut through treaty land. Camps sprang up along creeks in the hills. Tents and rough cabins built from fresh-cut logs. Streams filled with tailings from sluice boxes. Forests thinned near the mining camps as wood went into flumes, shafts, stoves, and shoring timbers. Lakota hunters riding through the hills found whole slopes stripped of trees. Paths widened into roads, and streams clouded with mud where they had once run clear. Miners posted claims on paper tacked to trees and cabin walls, acts that ignored both treaty guarantees and Lakota concepts of land use. Lakota leaders protested through official channels. Delegations traveled under military escort to Washington, where they met with President Ulysses Grant and other officials. They reminded the government of the Fort Laramie Treaty and insisted that the Black Hills remain closed. Federal authorities, facing pressure from railroad companies, mining interests, and Western politicians, offered to buy the hills instead. Lakota representatives refused to sell, aware that once the hills left their control, the rest of the reservation would soon follow. The meetings ended with no agreement. In the meantime, traffic into the hills increased. The same rail lines that carried miners toward the Black Hills also carried news, mail, and supplies back out. Deadwood, a gold camp in a narrow valley, grew into a loud, crowded town of saloons, gambling rooms, and boarding houses. Freight wagons hauled food, tools, and equipment from railheads to its muddy streets. Stage lines ran on tight schedules, taking advantage of the reliability that rail connections gave them at each end of the route. Each new arrival in the hills deepened the violation of Lakota treaty rights. By late 1875, federal authorities decided to change policy. Agents at Missouri River agencies told Lakota bands that all those still hunting in the Powder River and Yellowstone country must report to the reservation agencies by a set date in the winter, or be treated as hostile. This order ignored traditional winter camp patterns and the fact that many bands had always spent cold months near good grazing and timber far from the agencies. It also ignored the disruption that would follow if thousands of people crowded around a few posts at once. For many Lakota, the demand sounded like the first step toward forcing them out of the open country entirely. When groups did not appear by the deadline, the War Department treated them as enemies. The plan for the campaign of 1876 set 3 columns in motion. One force under General George Crook moved north from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming Territory. Another under Colonel John Gibbon marched east from western Montana. A third, led by General Alfred Terry, left Fort Abraham Lincoln on the Missouri with Custer and the 7th Cavalry as part of its strength. Railroads supplied these columns. Goods traveled west and north by train to forts on the Platte and the Missouri, then went out by wagon. Ammunition, rations, and replacement animals reached staging points faster and in greater volume than in earlier frontier wars. In the camps along the Tongue, Powder, and Rosebud rivers, Lakota and Northern Cheyenne bands came together for the hunting season and for defense. Leaders such as Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Gall, and others gathered warriors and coordinated movements in ways that drew on long experience of intertribal conflict. They watched the approach of soldiers through reports from scouts who monitored the advance of wagon dust and the spread of army camps. They had no telegraph or train, but they knew the country and could move quickly across it. Their families camped in sheltered river bottoms where water, grass, and timber remained available. On June 17, 1876, Crook's column met a large Lakota and Northern Cheyenne force in the Rosebud Valley. The morning began with soldiers moving along the creek, pack train, and infantry strung out. Cavalry companies deployed on the flanks. Warriors rode down from the high ridges, using the breaks in the land for cover and approach. Fighting spread along the length of the column, with charges and countercharges across broken ground. Crook's men managed to hold their positions, but the fight left many on both sides dead or wounded. The general pulled his force back toward his base near Goose Creek, effectively removing it from the next stage of the campaign. The main Lakota and Northern Cheyenne village moved west and north after Rosebud, crossing divides toward the Little Bighorn Valley. Camps spread along the river in a long curve, teepees set near the water and horse herds grazing on nearby benches. Children played among the lodges, unaware of how close the war had drawn. Women scraped hides and cooked meat from recent hunts. Men cleaned weapons and talked about what would come next. Terry's column, moving from the east, sent Custer and the 7th Cavalry to scout ahead along the Rosebud and then toward the Little Bighorn. Custer had a map that showed rough outlines of the terrain and general instructions to locate and monitor any large village. His regiment rode across dry ridges and coulees, down into creek beds lined with cottonwoods, and over low divides. Scouts, including Arikara and Crow men, found signs of a large body of people moving. They reported heavy trails, old camp circles, and many pony tracks. On June 25, 1876, Custer divided his regiment into several battalions and moved to attack the village he knew now lay along the Little Bighorn. He underestimated its size. When his foremost companies approached, they found not a small scattered group, but a very large concentration of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne families and warriors. The exact details of how the fight unfolded on the ridges and ravines above the river have been debated in detail, but the result is clear. Custer's immediate command was surrounded and wiped out, while other companies under Reno and Benteen fought desperate defensive actions before being able to hold on and later withdraw. On the field south of the bluffs, the ground after the battle held dead soldiers, dead horses, scattered weapons, and torn equipment. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne fighters had killed Custer and more than 200 men of his battalion. They had taken casualties of their own as well. Women moved among the fallen after the fighting, looking for relatives and giving aid to wounded warriors. Survivors from the 7th Cavalry on the bluffs waited without water under a hot sun until relief reached them from Terry and Gibbon's approaching forces. News of the defeat traveled quickly once couriers and later telegraph messages reached the rail-linked forts and cities. Dispatches went out from the nearest telegraph station toward the east, where newspapers printed extra editions with headlines about a disaster on the Little Bighorn. In cities tied by rail to the Missouri, people read of Custer's death and of heavy casualties. Public reaction hardened against the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne. Calls went up for more troops and for a decisive end to resistance. Political leaders pointed to the battle as proof that treaty limits could no longer stand in the way of what they called development. The military response drew heavily on railroads. Additional units moved west by train to junctions on the Missouri and Platte, then marched into the theater. Cars carried not just soldiers but artillery, rations, and the supplies needed to build and maintain new posts. Engineers and laborers extended lines closer to the frontier, laying track from existing endpoints farther into Dakota territory. Every additional mile shortened the wagon haul between depots in the areas where troops operated. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne bands, knowing that the victory at the Little Bighorn would bring heavier pressure, broke the large village into smaller groups and moved into rougher country. Some went north toward the Yellowstone and the Canadian border. Others shifted back toward the Powder and Tongue. They tried to stay ahead of converging columns moving with families, children, and herds of horses through hills and along rivers. Travel grew harder as the summer passed. Game moved away from heavily used valleys. Forage for horses became scarcer. Rainstorms turned some trails into mud. Through late 1876 and into 1877, Army commands pressed steadily. Columns pursued small groups, striking at camps when they could. At Slim Buttes, soldiers attacked a Northern Cheyenne village, killing people, capturing others, and taking stores that the community needed to survive the coming winter. At other locations, troops surprised or overran camps, shooting into teepees, burning lodges, and seizing horses. Families fled into freezing conditions with little food or clothing. Winter tightened its grip. Snow covered the ground, making it harder to move quickly and to find grazing for horses. Some Lakota leaders, seeing that ammunition and food were nearly gone, decided to go into agency posts to save their people from starvation. They approached with white flags or under the escort of scouts who had shifted allegiance. Officers at the forts disarmed them, took their horses, and confined them near the agencies. Men who had ridden freely across the plains now stood in line for rations and watched soldiers move through their camps. Crazy Horse held out longer, leading a group that struggled through harsh conditions in the Powder River country. His followers endured hunger and cold, with many lacking adequate blankets or lodges. Children and elders suffered first. By the spring of 1877, he judged that further resistance would only bring more deaths among the families. He brought his band into Fort Robinson in Nebraska, where officers counted the people, took their weapons, and tried to direct them to a reservation. Later that year, after disputes over orders and movement, Crazy Horse was killed near the post guardhouse while under arrest, stabbed with a bayonet as soldiers restrained him. Sitting Bull refused to surrender. He led his people north into the plains that stretched toward the Canadian border. Crossing into what was then called the Northwest Territory, his band settled near Wood Mountain, where they tried to live by hunting the remaining buffalo and by trading with local people. Conditions there were harsh. Game grew scarce, and Canadian authorities offered only limited aid. Over time, hunger and sickness wore down the group. Years later, portions of his following returned to the United States and accepted life on reservations. While these events unfolded, government officials and railroad representatives negotiated over the Black Hills. Even before all bands had surrendered, a commission met with hand-picked Lakota delegates at agencies in 1876 and 1877. Under pressure and the threat of withholding rations, the United States obtained signatures on an agreement that ceded the Black Hills and opened them permanently to mining and settlement. The process ignored the requirement in earlier treaties that a large majority of adult male Lakota consent to such a change. Nonetheless, Congress treated the new agreement as valid. Railroad planners and mining companies now acted as if all legal barriers had fallen. Tracks pushed closer to the region from several directions. Lines in Nebraska and Dakota extended toward the Missouri crossings and beyond. Sidings in small towns grew along these new routes, serving as freight points for goods bound for the now secure mining camps in the hills and for the expanding network of reservation agencies. Cars that brought in machinery and food for Deadwood and other settlements also carried materials for agency warehouses and for new military posts that watched over confined Lakota and Northern Cheyenne populations. On the reservations, the change in daily life was stark. Families were assigned specific areas near the agencies with little room to range for hunting. Buffalo were gone from most of the surrounding plains. Men who had once measured their status in horses, war honors, and success in the hunt now found themselves told to take up small-scale farming or to work for wages hauling freight or cutting wood. Children attended agency schools where they were pressed to learn English and to abandon their own languages and clothing. Ration day dominated the week, as long lines formed near warehouse doors where clerks weighed flour, beef, and other issued items. Railroads defined the edges of this new confinement. From time to time, trains passed within sight or hearing of reservation lands, their whistles audible across the open country. Some Lakota men found seasonal work on track gangs or in loading crews, earning a little money but subject to white supervisors and strict schedules. Others watched from a distance, seeing in each passing freight the continuing removal of resources from lands they had once used without outside permission. The Great Sioux War ended not with a single formal ceremony on the plains, but with a series of surrenders, deaths, and enforced agreements stretched across several years. By 1877, the main organized Lakota and Northern Cheyenne resistance on the northern plains had been broken. Those who remained in the open faced starvation or exile. Those on reservations faced dependency and close control. Gold from the Black Hills moved out on wagons and increasingly on trains. Timber and stone from the region went into mine works, buildings, and rail structures. The same transportation network that had carried miners and soldiers toward the Black Hills now carried away their wealth and supported the institutions that held the original inhabitants in place. In those few years between Custer's expedition into the hills and the final surrenders, rails and telegraph lines played a constant supporting role. They funneled people and supplies into the region, carried news of battles to distant cities, helped shape public opinion, and then moved the tangible rewards of conquest out to markets. For Lakota and Northern Cheyenne communities, the Great Sioux War marked the moment when the combination of mineral hunger and railroad reach tore the central sacred hills from their control and forced their remaining lands into narrow, surveyed tracts. The Iron Horse did not simply pass through. It helped fix the outcome, leaving behind a west cut into zones of extraction and reservation where an older way of life could no longer move freely. On September 30th, 1877, the first Southern Pacific locomotive rolled off a new bridge over the Colorado River at Yuma and into Arizona territory while the afternoon heat pressed down on the river bottom. Smoke drifted across the adobe walls and warehouses of the old Quartermaster Depot on the bluff. For decades, that depot had stored barrels of flour, tools, ammunition, and uniforms, freighted up from the Gulf of California on shallow river steamers. Now rails reached the riverbank. Men on the new train stepped down onto ground that supply mules and wagon teams had worn into ruts, and they saw piles of government freight waiting under long sheds that would soon be less important than the freight house the railroad planned to build. The bridge itself was a heavy wooden and iron structure with piers sunk into the riverbed. Construction crews had fought drifting logs and sudden rises in water level while setting it. When the first locomotive crept across, wheels clicked over carefully spaced joints, and crewmen leaned out of the cab to watch the water sliding under them. On the Yuma side, townspeople gathered along the embankment and in the dusty streets. Officers from Fort Yuma looked on from the opposite bank. Some clapped and shouted when the locomotive reached dry land, treating the crossing as a public victory over isolation. Apache men did not stand in that crowd. Chiricahua and other Apache groups in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico watched such events from farther east, in country of dry basins and broken ranges. They already knew the routes wagons used to cross the desert and the springs that kept them alive. The new road of iron did not yet run through their core homelands, but it headed that way. Army officers had talked for years of a southern transcontinental line that would connect California to Texas and the Gulf states. With the bridge at Yuma in place, that line was no longer just survey marks on maps. From Yuma, Southern Pacific crews began pushing track east along the Gila River corridor. Grading gangs cut into low rises and built shallow fills where the ground dipped. Surveyors set stakes on lines that took the rails past mesquite thickets and across washes where summer storms sent sudden floods. Laborers from many backgrounds worked in the heat, including Chinese crews brought in under contract, Mexican trackmen from Sonora, and local Anglo workers hired at Yuma and other towns along the lower river. They slept in tents and rough bunkhouses made from scrap lumber, their bedding and tools coated each day with fine dust. Water defined their lives. Camps were placed near wells or river bends where barrels could be filled and hauled by wagon. Every mile away from a reliable source increased the risk of failure. Men on track gangs learned to carry canteens whenever they stepped away from camp. On some days, the air shimmered over the ballast and iron tools grew hot to the touch. Hands blistered on shovels and picks. Occasional storms answered the heat with sudden torrents that undercut fresh embankments and drove muddy water across stretches where ties had only just been set. The crews went back afterward and repaired what was lost. To the east, away from the river, the land rose in slow stages toward grasslands and scattered mountains. Apache people moved through that terrain according to older patterns, following game, gathering plants, and visiting relatives in neighboring bands. They had already seen an earlier wave of outsiders in the form of stage stations and mail routes that crossed Apache Pass, Doubtful Canyon, and the San Simon Valley. Those stations were built like small forts with rock walls and wells, and they had drawn repeated Apache attacks in the 1860s when Cochise and other leaders struck at travelers and soldiers who used the route. Fort Bowie had been planted at Apache Pass to protect that corridor. Its adobe and stone buildings facing a narrow defile where springs emerged from the ground. By the 1870s, many Apache bands had been driven onto reservations. In 1875, the government ordered all Apaches west of the Rio Grande to San Carlos Agency on the Gila River. Men and women who had been used to choosing their own camp locations were told to live near an agent's office and warehouse, under watch. Ration issues were irregular. Promised supplies often arrived late or in poor condition. Officials used hunger as leverage, threatening to cut rations for entire groups if a few individuals left the reservation without permission. Some Apache headmen accepted the new limits for a time in hopes of sparing their families more bloodshed. Others refused. Among the latter was Geronimo, a Chiricahua Apache war leader whose personal losses in Mexico years earlier had locked him into a long cycle of raids and retaliation. Reservation life at San Carlos, with its crowded camps and constant surveillance, felt intolerable to him and to those who followed him. He left the agency more than once with a group of warriors, women, and children, moving south into the Sierra Madre Mountains of northern Mexico, and then back into Arizona and New Mexico to raid ranches, mining camps, and smaller settlements. United States and Mexican forces both hunted these bands, sometimes under a cross-border agreement that allowed troops from one country to pursue their targets into the other. While this struggle went on, Southern Pacific Railhead advanced steadily. After the bridge at Yuma, grades and ties moved across the desert in stages. By March 17, 1880, the line reached Tucson. On the day the first regular train rolled into town, residents lined the low platform and nearby streets. Wooden buildings that had faced wagon traffic now opened onto the rails. Merchants readied freight lists that would send ore, hides, grain, and other goods west to California ports and eastward along connections that were still forming. The arrival of the train marked a sharp change for Tucson's economy, linking it directly to coastal markets and to eastern cities. For Apache people watching from a distance, Tucson's celebration meant something different. The town had already been a base for military campaigns into Apache country. Now it had a faster supply line. Carloads of ammunition, hardtack, and uniforms that once took weeks by wagon from the Pacific coast could arrive in a few days. More settlers and miners would come. More patrols would leave the depots along the track. The movement of steel into the desert meant increased reach for the same forces that were pressing Apaches toward San Carlos and other agencies. From Tucson, Southern Pacific engineers chose a route that swung southeast toward the San Pedro River and then across Cochise County. The line reached the site that became Benson in 1880, a mile west of an old stage station on the river. Benson grew quickly as a shipping point for ore from Tombstone and Bisbee to the south. Freight wagons heavy with silver and copper ore rolled up from those mining camps, crossing ground where Apache parties had once traveled freely. The ore went into boxcars. The empties went back out to be filled again. Benson's streets filled with freighters, saloon keepers, merchants, and railroad hands. Farther east, the track crossed open plains dotted with mesquite and creosote before reaching the area near Fort Bowie. Engineers did not run the main line directly through Apache Pass where the fort stood, but they came close. Instead, they brought the rails around through lower ground, then out toward the San Simon Valley and into Steins Pass on the border of Arizona and New Mexico. In that country, Southern Pacific opened a rock quarry in the late 1870s to produce ballast. More than 1,000 Chinese laborers worked at the base of barren mountains, breaking rock and loading it into construction trains. The nearest water was poor, alkaline, and hard on the stomach. Supplies and drinkable water were hauled in by train. Heat in summer and cold winds in winter cut through the scattered tents and shacks. The landscape these crews worked in overlapped with areas where Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apache groups had traveled for years. Doubtful Canyon, San Simon, Apache Pass, and Dragoon Springs lay along older paths that Apaches knew well. Stage stations there had seen ambushes and sieges when Cochise and his followers fought the United States after the Bascom Affair of 1861. By the time the railroad crews arrived, Fort Bowie and other posts had pushed many Apache bands away from those immediate corridors. But memories of the earlier fighting remained strong on both sides. Soldiers escorting surveyors along the new line could still point out ruined station walls and graves from the stage route era. As track reached Steins Pass and then crossed into New Mexico in late 1880, the company created small stations and sidings at places that later took names such as San Simon, Bowie, Lordsburg, and Deming. At most of these points, the built environment amounted to a depot, water tank, section house, and a few hastily thrown together stores or saloons. Water tanks drew from wells or hauled in supplies, serving locomotives first. Residents of nearby settlements sometimes had to buy water brought in by train. Rainfall remained sparse. Dust blew across ties and ballast. Telegraph poles followed the rails, carrying messages that linked these tiny clusters directly to offices in larger cities. On paper, the Southern Pacific of New Mexico advanced with remarkable speed once its corporate structure was in place. In practice, progress had to account for harsh terrain and for the remnants of Apache resistance that still moved through the mountains south of the line. Army commands in the region kept close watch on traffic, and patrols rode out from posts to investigate reports of raiding or sightings of bands away from reservations. Telegraph operators along the track passed word of trouble to departmental headquarters, where officers weighed the risk of sending small detachments against waiting for larger forces. In May 1881, Southern Pacific reached El Paso, tying Arizona and New Mexico by rail to Texas. El Paso's dusty streets shifted quickly from a border town served by river and trail to a rail junction where multiple lines met. Fort Bliss nearby drew supplies by train. Troops transferred from cars to wagons and then went out toward the Guadalupe Mountains, the Rio Grande, and points west. The railroad's arrival in El Paso intensified the movement of settlers, miners, and merchants into the surrounding region and gave military commanders another strong base from which to run operations south and west into Apache country. While rails were stretching across the southern deserts, the last phase of the Apache Wars unfolded. Geronimo and his followers moved repeatedly between the San Carlos Reservation, the Sierra Madre in Mexico, and the mountains of southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. They raided ranches, mining camps, and smaller settlements on both sides of the border, taking stock and supplies, sometimes killing settlers or miners, sometimes burning buildings that stood along their paths. United States Generals George Crook and later Nelson Miles led campaigns that relied on Apache scouts as well as Anglo and Hispanic troops, using hard marches through rough terrain to try to corner the raiding bands. The railroad supported these campaigns even if the main fighting did not take place directly along the tracks. Supplies for posts at Bowie, Huachuca, Thomas, and other positions arrived faster because they came most of the way by train. Ammunition, clothing, and rations that once would have been limited by wagon traffic could now be brought in larger quantities to railheads and then forwarded. Troops from distant regiments rode trains to staging points in Texas and Arizona, stepping off near the desert and then mounting fresh horses for the push into canyons and ranges. Telegraph lines beside the rails carried orders and reports between departmental headquarters and field commands, shortening the time between decision and action. On the ground, Apache fighters still relied on knowledge of water sources, hidden trails, and sheltering rock. They used small groups and surprise attacks to offset the Army's superior numbers and equipment. They slipped through gaps between patrols, crossed into Mexico when pressure grew too tight, and scattered into the hills when columns approached. Families moved with them, carrying children and elderly relatives on travois or on spare animals. Food grew scarce over repeated campaigns. Some nights the people went to sleep hungry and woke to another day of movement. Gradually, constant pursuit and limited resources wore down the bands that remained in the field. By 1886, Geronimo's group had been reduced in size and had surrendered more than once, only to slip away again, further undermining trust between him and United States officers. In late summer that year, after negotiations in the Sierra Madre and a final understanding with General Miles's representatives, Geronimo and his remaining followers came into a meeting place in the borderlands. On September 4, 1886, he surrendered formally, giving up arms with the understanding that his people would be relocated, but expecting that they might eventually return to their home region. Instead, the government decided to remove the Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apaches as far as possible from the southwest. The instrument chosen for that removal was the railroad. After brief confinement near the border, prisoners were taken under guard to rail sidings where Southern Pacific cars waited. At one such place in Texas, near the Nueces River, on September 10, 1886, a group of Apache men, women, and children were photographed during a rest stop beside the track, with coaches looming behind them and armed guards close at hand. The image shows Geronimo near the front, Nietzsche close by, and other leaders seated or standing on the embankment, their clothing dusty from the journey, their expressions set in ways that reflected exhaustion and anger more than any sense of resolution. Inside the cars, conditions were cramped. Seats designed for short trips now held people traveling under compulsion across much of the southern United States. Windows gave views of country they had once known only as rumor. Train motion and sudden jerks at couplings kept children off balance. Guards sat or stood nearby with rifles, watching doors and platforms at every stop. Some Apache passengers spoke quietly among themselves in their own language, trying to understand what lay ahead. They had heard names such as Florida and Alabama, but had no direct experience of the humidity, low country, and distant coastlines that waited there. The trains carried them east to San Antonio and beyond, where military authorities arranged transfers to other lines and then to ships. Men designated as the most dangerous, including Geronimo and a selected group of warriors, were sent to Fort Pickens on the Barrier Island near Pensacola, Florida. Women, children, and some other men went to Fort Marion in St. Augustine. Later, most of the Chiricahua prisoners were moved again by rail to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. At each stage, they boarded and left trains under guard, watched by local onlookers who often treated their passage as a spectacle. Back in Arizona and New Mexico, trains continued to move through the former ranges of these same people. Southern Pacific locomotives pulled freight and passenger cars across Steins Pass, through the San Simon Valley past Bowie and Benson, and on toward Tucson and Yuma in one direction and El Paso in the other. Stations along the route grew into permanent towns with depots, warehouses, and rows of houses. Mining outfits shipped ore by rail instead of by wagon. Cattlemen loaded stock into cars bound for distant markets. Soldiers still rode trains to reach posts, but there were no longer independent Apache bands in the surrounding hills to meet them in battle. San Carlos Reservation remained crowded and heavily supervised. Chiricahua families were gone from their home canyons. Other Apache groups, such as the White Mountain and Western Apache, lived under the close control of agents and the army as well, their travel tightly restricted. Children from these communities were later sent by rail again, this time to boarding schools in places like Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where officials tried to strip away language and cultural practices. The pattern of using railroad cars to separate people from their homelands and from one another became a recurring tool of federal Indian policy. Along the Southern Pacific's desert main line, older stage station ruins and fort sites remained visible near the tracks. Travelers looking out windows could see the low walls of Dragoon-era outposts, the outlines of abandoned way stations, and the dry cuts of the old wagon road in places where it still ran parallel to the rails. Few of those passengers understood how closely their path overlapped with routes once watched and defended by Apache scouts and warriors. What they noticed more often were the depots, sidings, and growing towns that the railroad fed. By the end of the 1880s, Southern Pacific trains had turned the long east-west corridor across southern Arizona and New Mexico into a regular artery of commerce and travel. The line's presence convinced investors and settlers that the region was safe enough for sustained mining and ranching despite its harsh climate. That sense of safety rested in part on the fact that Apache resistance had been broken and that the remaining Apache people had been confined on distant reservations and in prisoner of war camps reached by the same rails. Where once mounted raiders had watched over narrow passes and springs, section crews now walked ballast with tools in hand, and telegraph operators tapped out messages in depots that hummed with local trade. The Southern Pacific through Apache country did more than change how goods moved across the desert. Its construction and operation coincided with and helped sustain the final campaigns that ended Apache freedom of movement in that region. The line brought supplies and troops into the war zone and then carried the defeated out toward humid coastal forts and distant barracks. In the years that followed, the trains that crossed Steins Pass and Yuma carried tourists, farmers, miners, and soldiers who rarely thought about whose removal had made their journeys possible, even as the rails continued to run through ranges and valleys where Apache families had once chosen their own routes and their own destinations. In the late autumn of 1879, smoke from a Pennsylvania railroad train settled over the old cavalry barracks at Carlisle as the first group of native children stepped down from the cars. The buildings on the grounds had once housed United States soldiers and horses. Now flags hung from poles near the gate, desks filled offices that had served as officers' quarters, and a new sign marked the place as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The people who ran it spoke of turning the children into students and workers for a world beyond their reservations. They planned to use the same rail lines that had carried troops and freight west to bring children east and to keep them far from their families for years at a time. The first children came from Dakota and Indian Territory agencies pulled from Lakota, Cheyenne, Pawnee, Kiowa, and other communities. Most had never seen a steam locomotive up close. At the agencies, they had been gathered by agents and interpreters who spoke about schooling, about learning English, and about new opportunities while soldiers stood nearby with rifles. Some parents agreed, believing that sending one or two children might help the family in the new order that surrounded them. Others resisted, pointing to past broken promises and to the risk of disease and death in distant places. Pressure from officials fell hardest on those who refused. On the day of departure, agency yards filled with wagons, animals, and people. Children carried small bundles, some with clothing their mothers had sewn, some with small keepsakes. Mothers adjusted blankets around shoulders one last time, smoothing hair that would soon be cut in Carlisle's dormitories. Fathers stood slightly apart in many cases, faces set, watching agents hurry the process. Soldiers moved along the edges, urging people forward when moments of grief slowed the line. The sound of the arriving train silenced conversation for a short span as the engine pulled up with its string of coaches and baggage cars. Station platforms near the agencies were crowded when the children boarded. Some climbed stairs hesitantly, looking back over their shoulders toward families held back by guards. Others were lifted up by agents or soldiers when they paused too long. Windows of the coaches framed rows of young faces as the train prepared to move. A few hands pressed to the glass, palms leaving faint shapes on the fogged surface as breath met cold. Parents on the platform waved, called out names, and in some cases followed the cars along the track until the train picked up enough speed to pull away. Inside, the children sat on hard seats, clothing still smelling of smoke from home fires. Many did not share a language with every other passenger, since the group represented multiple nations. Some spoke only Lakota, some Cheyenne, some Kiowa or Pawnee. Some already knew a little English from mission schools or agency dealings. Pratt and his staff moved through the cars, checking lists and trying to match faces to names written in ledgers. To the staff, this journey marked the start of a grand experiment in breaking ties between children and the cultures that had shaped them. To the children, it felt like being carried into uncertainty in a machine that never seemed to tire. The route east from the plains crossed rivers, farms, and cities. At each stop, the children saw sights that had been only words in earlier talks with missionaries and agents. Brick depots with long platforms replaced low wooden buildings common near agencies. Crowded streets, piled freight, and rows of houses that touched one another marked the larger towns. In some places, white onlookers gathered to stare at the car windows, pointing out the travelers and making casual remarks about their clothing and hair. The children watched in both directions, seeing a world that had sent soldiers and surveyors into their homelands, and realizing how far that world extended. Nights on the train brought little rest. The cars swayed and jolted. Lantern light glowed from overhead fixtures. Conductors moved along the aisle to check tickets and orders. Younger children cried at times, missing parents or frightened by the constant noise. Older boys and girls tried to comfort them in low voices, sharing scraps of food or passing along stories from home to keep memories close. In rare pauses when the train halted on a siding to let another pass, the sudden silence felt almost as unsettling as the movement. When the train finally arrived at Carlisle, the air smelled of coal smoke and damp earth. Staff members in dark coats waited on the platform with policemen and townspeople. Pratt stood where he could see every child step down. He had served in the Army and at an earlier prison for native prisoners of war in Florida, where he had tested his belief that, in his words, education and strict discipline could change people. At Carlisle, he intended to apply that belief to children on a larger scale, using school routines and manual labor to strip away language, clothing, and ceremony. The march from the station to the school grounds took the children past brick houses, churches, and shops. Residents stood on porches or sidewalks watching the column pass. Some saw the children as objects of curiosity or pity. Others viewed them as proof that the government had found a new way to handle what they called the Indian problem. On the parade ground at Carlisle, the group was lined up by height and separated by sex. Boys went toward one set of barracks, girls toward another. Trunks and bundles were stacked near the entrance while staff prepared the next stage. Hair cutting came first for many. Traditional braids, which had carried personal and spiritual meaning in their communities, fell to the floor in piles. Barbers worked quickly, clipping hair short to match military styles. Some children wept quietly, feeling the loss as a deep blow. Others sat in stunned silence. Afterward, staff issued uniforms. Boys received dark coats, trousers, and stiff shoes. Girls received dresses fashioned after Eastern patterns. Moccasins and older clothing went into heaps, sometimes burned or stored away where their owners could not reach them. New names followed. Teachers and administrators went down lists and assigned English-given names and surnames, often without understanding the meanings of the original native names or caring about their importance. Children learned to answer to these new labels in roll call and in class. Punishments, including extra drills, confinement, or loss of food, met those who persisted in using their original names or languages. The shift was not only about convenience. It was part of an effort to replace kin networks and clan identities with numbers in school registers, and with identities that fit better into federal records. Daily life at Carlisle fell into a strict pattern. A bell rang early, calling students from their beds in the barracks. Lines formed on the parade ground for roll call and inspection. Breakfast followed in a large dining hall where long tables and benches echoed with the clatter of utensils on tin plates. After the meal, older boys drilled on the grounds under the direction of military officers or teachers who had served in the army. Uniforms had to be clean, boots had to shine, and movements in formation were expected to be sharp. Classroom hours came next. Children sat at wooden desks facing blackboards where teachers wrote English words, arithmetic problems, and simple American history lessons. Instruction in reading and writing English dominated the schedule. Teachers discouraged and often punished the use of native languages. Hands that slipped into signs or mouths that formed familiar words during class drew quick reprimands. Stories about battles on the plains became abstract lessons about national progress, stripped of the voices of those who had fought against soldiers. Afternoons split between more classes and manual labor. Boys learned trades such as blacksmithing, carpentry, shoemaking, and printing. They worked in shops on the grounds, producing shoes, harnesses, and other items the school needed. Girls learned sewing, cooking, laundering, and housekeeping in supervised rooms that mimicked the homes of Eastern families. They cleaned dormitories, mended uniforms, and prepared food not only for themselves but also for staff and guests. The idea behind this structure was clear. The school's leaders wanted graduates who would take low-paid jobs in farms, workshops, and households rather than return to independent life on reservations. Religious instruction formed another layer. Missionaries and local ministers led services where hymns in English filled the chapel. Prayers were spoken in English, and Christian doctrine was taught as superior to tribal beliefs. Children were pressed to abandon ceremonies and practices from home, told that those old ways stood in the path of salvation. Some accepted parts of this under pressure or from curiosity, while others held tight to memories of songs and stories from elders, repeating them only in whispers when they felt sure no teacher listened. Illness and death visited the school regularly. Children came from distant climates and from communities where exposure to new diseases had already weakened many. Crowded dormitories, poor ventilation, and demanding schedules made them more vulnerable. Coughs echoed at night from rows of beds. Fevers ran through entire dorms in waves. Tuberculosis, measles, and other infections claimed lives. The school cemetery on the grounds grew as small graves took in children who had died far from family. Headboards carried their assigned English names or sometimes only partial identifications. Railroads played a role not only in bringing children to Carlisle, but also in scattering them outward. The school developed an outing program that sent students to work for white families during summers and sometimes for longer stretches on farms, in workshops, or in urban homes across Pennsylvania and nearby states. At the start and end of these seasons, students boarded trains again. They traveled alone or in small groups to towns where host families met them on platforms. In these placements, they lived under rules set by employers who expected cheap labor and obedience more than they offered genuine education. Letters from some children and from certain host families flowed back to Carlisle, carried by the same rail and postal system. Administrators used positive reports as proof that the program succeeded, pointing to cases where a student had learned a trade or improved spoken English. Negative experiences, including abuse, overwork, or neglect, often went unrecorded or were dismissed when raised. Students who returned from outings sometimes bore scars, visible and hidden from what they had endured. Yet the trains kept carrying them out each year because the program allowed the school to claim that it reduced costs and helped integrate students into mainstream society. Other off-reservation schools adopted similar patterns. Haskell Institute in Kansas, Genoa in Nebraska, Phoenix in Arizona, and Chilocco in Indian Territory. All relied on rail connections to gather students from many tribes. Children boarded trains at reservations scattered across the West and Midwest with tags pinned to their clothing listing destinations, and sometimes numbers matching school rosters. The journey might last days, with changes of cars at junctions where students huddled together on benches among strangers. At each school, routines echoed Carlyle's model of barracks living, uniform work, English-only instruction, and religious pressure. Back on the reservations, the absence of children reshaped life. Grandparents missed the help of young hands in daily tasks and the sound of familiar languages spoken by new voices. Parents struggled with grief and with anger directed at agents and missionaries who had pushed for removal. Ceremonies that once included all ages now lacked the presence of many youths, breaking the natural line of teaching between elders and the next generation. When children did return after years away, they often carried mixed feelings, caught between the training imposed at school and the ways of home they had been told to reject. Some of those who came back from Carlisle tried to use their education to help their communities, working as interpreters, clerks, or teachers at reservation schools. They moved in two worlds, writing letters to officials and reading government notices while also participating in tribal gatherings. Others felt pulled more strongly toward the towns and cities they had glimpsed through school placements, seeking work there and sometimes losing contact with relatives. In both cases, the long train journeys that had taken them east and back marked a dividing line in their lives. Resistance continued in various forms. Parents refused to send more children when they could, hid them during agency visits, or delayed decisions as long as possible. In some regions, groups confronted agents directly or threatened violence if more removals took place. Officials answered with threats to cut rations or with actual arrests. The power of railroads and distant schools rested not only on physical tracks and buildings, but also on this ability to tie survival to compliance. Families already weakened by the loss of bison and land faced a choice between open defiance and reluctant cooperation under constant pressure. By the close of the 1880s, trains carrying native children had become a familiar sight at many junctions. Engineers, brakemen, and station masters saw small groups in uniform, escorted by teachers or agents, moving through their depots at regular intervals. For them, the children were part of a broader traffic that included immigrants, soldiers, and ordinary travelers. For the children and their families, each departure and arrival carried weight measured in separation, change, and loss. The rails that once brought surveyors and troops into native homelands now served as corridors for a different kind of campaign, one aimed at reshaping minds and identities rather than seizing ground by force. Steel and steam did not fire bullets or haul artillery. They moved young lives away from the lands and languages that had formed them and into institutions built on the belief that survival in the changed West required surrendering much of what their elders held dear. The tracks stretching toward Carlisle and other schools turned distance into a tool of policy, splitting families and communities just as surely as earlier lines of rail had split the plains and mountains. In February 1887, lawmakers in Washington sat over another set of maps when the General Allotment Act, known under the name of Senator Henry Dawes, went through Congress and onto the president's desk. Lines on those maps showed reservation boundaries that had survived earlier rounds of treaties and executive orders. The new law aimed to break those large blocks into smaller parcels assigned to individuals, to mark each section with survey stakes, and to declare whatever remained as surplus land open to non-native settlement. Paper language spoke of citizenship, farming, and civilization. On the ground, it set in motion a process that cut into the last sizable pieces of native-held territory on the plains. Survey crews headed west again, this time not to trace the route of a main line but to slice reservations into grids. At Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Rosebud, and Pine Ridge, men with chains and transits walked fields and draws that families had used without fences. They hammered stakes into places where lodges had stood for winters, into hay meadows near creeks, and into strips of bottomland where small gardens grew between cottonwoods. Each stake carried a number in a ledger. Agents explained that in time each enrolled person would be assigned a certain number of acres, with heads of families receiving the largest allotments and children smaller pieces. For many Lakota and other tribal members, the idea of owning a narrow rectangle of land apart from their community's shared claim went against everything they had known. Meetings in agency council houses became tense. Officials used phrases taken from the Dawes Act about teaching individual industry and ending what they called nomadic habits. They promised that title to allotted land would eventually protect families from outside seizure. Men such as Sitting Bull at Standing Rock and other headmen listened in silence or spoke sharply against the changes. They understood that once surplus land left tribal control, it would never return. Some refused to sign any agreement. Others, worn down by years of hunger and broken pledges, hesitated before putting their marks on documents they distrusted. Railroads stood close to this process even when tracks did not yet cross the reservations themselves. By the late 1880s, lines of the Chicago and Northwestern, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, and the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley reached towns just outside the Great Sioux holdings. Depots at places such as Pierre, Rapid City, Chadron, and Valentine served as supply points for agencies and as gathering spots for settlers watching federal policy. Agents and surveyors rode trains to these towns, then moved by wagon into the reservations. Officials knew that once allotment created individual titles and opened surplus areas, the same rail lines would bring in land seekers eager for farms and town lots. During the same years, Congress and the administration moved to cut down the size of the Great Sioux Reservation itself. In 1889, a commission headed by General George Crook and others went from agency to agency with a proposal to break the single large reservation into several smaller ones and to sell off millions of acres between them. In crowded council rooms, commissioners read out terms that offered money and supplies in exchange for consent to the division. Ration cuts and delayed payments put added pressure on families. Many people signed under duress, knowing that refusal could mean more hunger. Sitting Bull and some other leaders held out, but the government claimed that enough signatures had been obtained and moved forward with the plan. Once Congress ratified the agreement, the Great Sioux Reservation broke into separate units such as Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, Standing Rock, Lower Brule, and Crow Creek. Wide tracts between these pieces opened to non-native settlement. Railroads extended branch lines and projected new routes through the newly available land, encouraging town companies to plat sites and farmers to file claims. Newspaper advertisements in eastern states and in Europe praised the soil and climate of what had a short time earlier been reservation ground. Immigrants and Americans from older states rode trains west with land notices in their pockets, stepping down at depots that had quickly grown up along the tracks. Inside the remaining reservations, life tightened. Buffalo were gone. Game of any size had become scarce even in remote corners. Families relied heavily on government rations, which shifted with political debate in Washington. In 1889 and 1890, appropriations for the Sioux agencies fell short of needs. Agents cut issue quantities of beef, flour, and sugar. Lines at warehouses grew longer. Men and women stared at empty shelves at home and at the weighed portions on ration days and wondered how to stretch each week's allotment. Children went to bed with stomachs still aching. The new land system also altered daily work. Allotment schedules required that each family move toward occupying its assigned parcel if it wanted to hold title. Agents urged men to plow fields and plant crops on ground that had never seen a breaking plow. The soil in many places was thin with limited rainfall. Tools were scarce, livestock for pulling plows even scarcer. Some people tried to follow the instructions, feeling they had no other path. Others saw the effort as a trap that would leave them tied to small plots while the spaces between filled with fences, towns, and rail sidings. In this atmosphere of hunger, confinement, and rapid change, word reached the northern plains of a new religious movement that had begun farther west. In Nevada, a northern Paiute man known as Wovoka had experienced a powerful vision during an eclipse in 1889 and had spoken of a time when native people would be renewed, when the dead would return, and when the land would be restored. He taught a round dance and preached nonviolence, saying that people should live honestly, work, and avoid alcohol. As his message traveled east through visiting delegations and later through letters, some details shifted. On the plains, talk about the coming renewal blended with deep grief over lost land and bison. In 1890, Lakota men such as Kicking Bear and Short Bull carried the new teachings onto the Sioux reservations. They spoke of a day when the old world would come back, when game would again cover the hills and when the weight of white intrusion would lift. They introduced the ghost dance, a circle dance performed in repeated sessions over days. Followers believed that by dancing, praying, and wearing special shirts painted with symbols, they drew nearer to the promised change. On Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Standing Rock, and Cheyenne River, people gathered on open patches of ground to dance until exhaustion, singing words that described a world made right. From agency buildings and from nearby towns, white observers watched with growing alarm. Agents whose reports had long framed Native activity for the Office of Indian Affairs sent letters and telegrams describing what they called a craze or mania. They complained that people neglected farm work and ignored orders. Some insisted that the dancers planned an uprising and that the movement would lead to a general war. Newspapers in rail-connected cities repeated and magnified these reports, printing stories about ghost shirts that bullets could not penetrate and about thousands of armed warriors ready to strike. Each retelling added more fear. Telegraph wires and railroads carried this alarm quickly. Officials in Washington received urgent messages from Dakota agencies. They read calls for troops and for the removal of certain leaders believed to be at the center of the ghost dance. Within days, orders went out sending companies from posts across the west toward the Sioux reservations. Units traveled by train as far as track allowed, then marched the remaining distance. The same steel rails that had brought surveyors and settlers to the plains now brought soldiers again, this time to stand watch over hungry people who sought hope in a new prayer. At Standing Rock, attention focused on Sitting Bull. Agents and military officers believed that his influence might carry the ghost dance from religious expression into armed resistance, although accounts of his actual position varied. In December 1890, Indian police at Standing Rock, backed by soldiers nearby, received orders to arrest him in his camp on the Grand River. Before dawn on December 15th, a detachment rode into the cluster of log houses and teepees where he lived. They entered his cabin and told him he must come with them. Outside, tension rose quickly. Supporters of Sitting Bull gathered, some armed, some simply shouting. As the police tried to move their prisoner toward a waiting horse, pushing and pulling broke the line. A shot went off in the jostling. In the confusion, bullets flew in both directions. When the shooting ended, Sitting Bull lay dead, as did several policemen and followers. His body was carried away while soldiers rushed in to impose control. News of his killing spread rapidly along the telegraph and through word of mouth. sending shock and fear through Lakota communities. Many who had followed Sitting Bull or who lived near his camp fled south after his death, fearing further arrests or attacks. Some joined the band of Minneconjou Lakota, led by Spotted Elk known as Bigfoot, on the Cheyenne River Reservation. Bigfoot's people had long been under pressure from shortages and orders, and he had a reputation as a man who tried to avoid direct conflict with the army. Now, with troops in motion and ghost dance gatherings under suspicion, he decided to move his band toward Pine Ridge, hoping to place his followers under the protection of Red Cloud and to negotiate safety. In late December 1890, Bigfoot's group, including many women and children, moved south in cold weather. Snow covered the ground in patches, and the air cut into lungs with each breath. Bigfoot himself was sick with pneumonia, coughing and weak, wrapped in blankets as he rode in a wagon. The band's progress slowed by illness and the presence of elders and infants. They camped where they could find a little shelter from the wind, building small fires from scant wood. They knew troops moved in the area but hoped to reach Pine Ridge before soldiers forced a confrontation. The Army had other plans. The 7th Cavalry, under Colonel James Forsyth, moved out from nearby posts with orders to intercept Bigfoot's band and to bring the people in. On December 28th, scouts spotted the Lakota camp near Porcupine Creek. Soldiers rode in and surrounded the group. Bigfoot, bundled in blankets, stepped forward as best he could to talk. He made no attempt at resistance. Forsyth ordered the band escorted to a new camp near Wounded Knee Creek, closer to the Pine Ridge Agency. That evening, the Lakota were moved to a low valley near the creek and told to pitch their teepees within a tight perimeter. Soldiers formed a ring around them. 4 Hotchkiss artillery pieces were hauled onto the low rises overlooking the camp, their muzzles pointed inward. The night turned bitter. Women tried to keep children warm in the crowded lodges while listening to the muffled sounds of soldiers on the hills. Men sat awake, talking in low tones about what might happen in the morning. They had given up their few guns when first stopped, but the tension around them did not ease. At first light on December 29th, the soldiers ordered the Lakota out of their teepees. Men were lined up together, women and children held nearby. Units of the 7th Cavalry took positions around them, rifles loaded. The Hotchkiss guns remained on the surrounding rises, crews standing by their breech mechanisms. An officer announced that the men would be searched for any remaining weapons. Soldiers moved through the line, taking knives, hatchets, and a few hidden guns. During the search, a dispute broke out over a rifle that belonged to a young man who did not want to give it up. Accounts differ on exactly when the first shot came and who pulled the trigger. But once that first report sounded, the line of soldiers responded almost at once. Rifles fired point blank into the mass of Lakota men. The Hotchkiss crews swung their guns down and began to fire shells into the camp area where women, children, and any men who tried to flee ran for cover. Explosions tore through teepees and through the clusters of people around them. Horses broke loose and ran, some shot down as they bolted. The valley filled with screams, gunfire, and the sound of shells striking earth and flesh. Some Lakota men managed to grab rifles or clubs and struck back in the chaos, but they were few and outgunned. Many fell where they stood in the first moments. Women clutching infants tried to run toward the creek or up the low slopes, only to meet volleys from troops placed to cover every direction. Children darted among the bodies, some hit, some stumbling on in shock. Within a short time, most organized resistance ended, replaced by scattered attempts to escape across the snow. Soldiers pursued fleeing figures beyond the immediate camp. Several small groups of women and children were shot down at some distance from the original circle, their bodies later found lying alone or in pairs on the frozen ground. Back near the teepees, smoke from burning canvas and wood mixed with the smell of blood and powder. By the time the firing faded, the valley floor and slopes were strewn with dead and wounded Lakota. Several soldiers also lay dead, some hit by friendly fire in the confusion, others by the few shots that Lakota men had managed to return. Snow began to fall harder as the day went on. Wounded people lay where they had fallen, exposed to wind and cold. Some cried out for water or for relatives who no longer answered. Soldiers moved through the site, disarming those still alive and finishing off a few who tried to rise. They carried wounded troopers to hastily arranged wagons, wrapping them in blankets and sending them toward the agency where medical care waited. Lakota wounded received little attention at first. Word of the fight traveled quickly. Telegraph lines from nearby posts and towns carried initial reports that described Wounded Knee as a battle, emphasizing the deaths of soldiers and claiming that the 7th Cavalry had faced a determined attack. Newspapers printed these accounts beside headlines chosen to stir readers. Only later did more detailed reports, photographs, and testimonies from observers paint a clearer picture of the number of women and children among the dead. By then, the term massacre had begun to appear in some descriptions, while others continued to use the language of combat. For the Lakota survivors, the labels used in distant cities meant little next to the immediate reality. The day after the shooting, a blizzard swept the valley. Rescuers and burial details could not move freely in the storm. Bodies lay under falling snow, frozen in positions that showed the suddenness of death, arms still raised or hands clutching children. When the weather eased, soldiers and hired civilians returned to the site. They gathered the dead into wagons or onto sleds and brought them to a mass grave on a nearby hill. Several photographs were taken during this grim work. One shows the open trench with bodies laid in layers, limbs overlapping, faces turned in different directions. Another shows the wreckage of the camp, teepees flattened, possessions scattered. These images later circulated widely, reaching audiences that had only read printed reports. They left little doubt about the scale of death among non-combatants. For many Lakota families, the photographs were painful confirmations of what they already knew from survivors' accounts and from the absence of loved ones. In the weeks after Wounded Knee, the ghost dance faded as an organized movement on the Sioux reservations. Some dancers had already been killed. Others, shaken by the violence, put away their shirts and songs. Agents banned the ceremonies outright, and military patrols enforced the ban. At the same time, allotment and land division continued. Surveyors went back to their work. Allotment rolls grew and parcels changed hands, sometimes under pressure, sometimes through sales driven by poverty. Where Lakota people had once moved freely across a broad reservation, they now found their movements checked by property lines, fences, and patrols. Railroads continued to expand their reach around these constrained spaces. Branch lines carried cattle raised on former reservation land to stockyards in cities. Boxcars loaded with grain and timber rolled past reservation edges. Reservation agencies received flour, sugar, and cloth by rail, the arrival of cars at nearby sidings signaling the next ration issue. From time to time, groups of children once again boarded trains for distant boarding schools, repeating the pattern Carlisle had set. Steel and schedules ordered much of the life around them, even as many tried to hold on to language, stories, and ceremonies in private. By the end of 1890, census takers recorded a sharp decline in the native population compared to earlier decades. Officials in Washington declared the frontier closed, claiming that no continuous line of unsettled territory remained. For Lakota and many other native nations, that declaration did not match lived experience. Their homelands still held open sky, grass, and rivers, but the structure of control had changed. Treaties, allotment patents, railroad timetables, and military orders now defined where people could live, how they could travel, and what work they could do. The killings at Wounded Knee stood as a visible point in that transformation. In that valley, a column of soldiers, supplied and reinforced through the same rail network that had spread across the West in earlier decades, surrounded a starving band that had tried to reach shelter under an agency flag. The violence that followed marked the end of large-scale armed resistance on the northern plains. From that winter forward, the Iron Horse and the Survey Stake did not face massed warriors in open country. They moved through a landscape of reservations, allotments, and fences where native people lived under watch. Their world cut into pieces by policies and tracks that had begun with decisions in distant rooms many years earlier.